Chapter 90. The effect of the number 9 holy water was not as fast as the number 7 holy water. Its recovery effect could only drag Brando back from the clutches of death. Then, with the help of the Shire and Freya, he bandaged himself and relied on his battlefield first aid skill to force himself to breathe a sigh of relief. Although he could not help but feel dizzy due to excessive blood loss, and his face was as pale as a ghost, he could at least confirm that he was no longer in danger from the data of his body. Brando stood up shakily. Because he was too weak, there were a few times when he almost knelt down again. The Shire and Freya hurriedly supported him on both sides. But when he felt the actions of the future goddess of war, Brando could not help but look back at her in surprise. He thought that Freya would be so angry at him for joking that she would not be appeased for at least a day. Freya hurriedly turned her head to the side, her face red. Although she was angry at Brando for deliberately lying to her, after thinking about it, at least it was easier for her to accept the result than losing Brando. Of course, she was still gnashing her teeth in anger. She repeatedly told herself that she would not fall for this despicable fellow's tricks so easily next time. Of course, even though he was surprised, he did not forget what he wanted to do. He put one hand on the Shire's horse, then turned to his squire and said, "The Shire, help me up." Before Brando could finish his words and the Shire had no time to respond, Freya stopped him. "Wait, what do you want to do?" "Sit on the horse's back, as you can see." "No." "What's wrong?" Brando was stunned. "You're so badly injured, don't move around. Why don't you care if others are worried?" The ponytailed girl lowered her head and complained softly with a red face. She could not help but think that it seemed to be the same every time. It was the same the last time too. Did this guy know that his injury would be fatal if it were an ordinary person? Brando saw Freya's expression and understood what was going on. He could not help but soften his heart and smile. "Freya, I'm really fine. The potion I took earlier was the holy water. You saw how it saved Jonathan's life that night, right?" Freya bit her lip. Her heart was a little moved, but she did not dare to believe him completely. She saw that Brando could not even stand properly, but he still wanted to ride the horse. She knew that every time she spoke, she would be at a disadvantage. So this time, the ponytailed girl did not say anything. She stubbornly lowered her head and stood in front of Brando. This time, Brando was a little helpless. He could not explain the difference between holy water number 9 and holy water number 7. Besides, even if he did explain, Freya might not understand. But he did not want to hurt Freya. After all, the future goddess of war was at least thinking of him at this moment. How could he say anything to such a girl? "Freya, let his lordship go up." But he was relieved when the Shire spoke at this time. Freya was stunned. She thought that at least the young wizard squire would be on her side. That was the knight he followed. In Wonde, squires were honored because they were knights. The Shire did not care about Brando's life at all. "The Shire, why are you?" For a moment, she did not know what position to use to refute. "His lordship is indeed not in any danger. He is just a little weak, but please leave the responsibility of looking after him to me," the young man replied. He could not help but look at Brando with some worry, but more than that, he was full of admiration and respect. His lordship is indeed on his side. If he appears on the horse, it means that he has not fallen. He is still the flag that leads us forward. This is his honor, and also the symbol of the sword in his hand. What is he fighting for? Brando smiled. The Shire made him sound a little too noble, but the truth was that simple. He had to appear on the horse to give the mercenaries and refugees behind him a sense of confidence. He had to tell them that victory was here. The battle just now was too intense, and it might have affected the refugees and the self-defense squad. Although he was not familiar with military affairs, He knew that his army was just a ragtag bunch that was put together at the last minute. They were fine when the wind was blowing, but once they met with a setback, they would quickly crumble. Thus, he had to give these people a sense of confidence. He was the source of their victory. As long as he was here, the refugees, mercenaries and the remnants of the White Mane army would know that they still had hope. Freya looked at Brando with a complicated expression. When she saw the latter nodding his head, she reluctantly moved aside. Brando then mounted the horse with the help of the Shire. But to be honest, when he got on the horse, he was so weak that he doubted if he could even hold on to the reins. He could not help but remember that he was just a normal person a few days ago. He did not even know what position he had to be so determined. But what surprised him was that he was able to stand upright on the horse like a javelin. It was as if in the eyes of outsiders, this young general had just changed his horse after another victory. Only the Shire, Freya, Reto and Mano could see the cold sweat on Brando's forehead and his trembling arms. But Brando did not say a word. He did not even look at the people around him. He tried his best to maintain a serious and cold expression. Reto and Mano could not help but look at each other. They then bowed deeply to Brando and retreated to command the cavalry that was regrouping. They wanted to help Brando, but when they saw this scene, they knew that Brando did not need them and would not let them help. Perhaps they did not understand his personality, but at the very least, they understood that he was a man with pride in his bones. This pride was not arrogance, but came from a young man's confidence in his own abilities. This pride was like a flag. Brando held back the cold sweat on his forehead as he rode his horse towards Sir Ebden, who was half kneeling on the ground. At the same time, he threw away the broken gargoyle amulet. Unlike being injured, the gargoyle amulet that was controlled by the gargoyle amulet would completely lose its function once it died in battle. Of course, it could be repaired, but it was not as complicated as making a new one. This was probably the most precious magic item that he had lost in the past few days. Other than that, the protective glove was also useless. Of course, it could still be repaired, but the end result would not be good. And the one who caused this loss was one of the 4 knights of the apocalypse, the White Knight, Ebden, who was kneeling in front of him. Before this, Brando had never thought that he would be able to defeat such a powerful general from Madara. But now, the absurdity had become reality. Ebden was half kneeling there quietly, and after a while, even if no one attacked it, it would probably burn out its last bit of soul fire. Brando knew everything about Ebden when he was alive. He was born in the year of the walnut and was born into a noble family. Then, he naturally became a knight and joined the Free Cavalry column to participate in the battle against the Northern Cruz people. He spent the golden period of his life there and grew from a little knight to a qualified commander. He had commanded several famous battles, which earned him quite a bit of fame in the kingdom. Then, he finished his life, and in the end, he somehow awakened as a dark undead. Brando knew most of what he knew in the game was history. After all, Ebden was one of the top generals in Madara during his time, and it was not easy to kill him. Therefore, he did not know much about this character's quest. But from today's battle, Brando suspected that this person might have a hidden quest, especially when he mentioned some details about the oath. And Brendel knew that most of the hidden quests in the game had extremely generous rewards. For example, the Ring of the Wind Empress in his hand was just the beginning of a hidden quest line. It was just a 20-ounce piece of equipment, which could be seen from this. But most of the hidden quests he knew were from level 40 onwards. Level 70 and 80 were the most common, and it was rare to receive a quest at this level. Furthermore, Ebden wasn't just a small character, therefore, he was very interested in this person's secrets. He rode his horse to Ebden's side. Because of his past identity, he did not make things difficult for him. "What do you want to say, Ebden?" There was a moment of silence. "Young man, do you know me?" The undead knight on the ground moved slightly and asked with a hoarse and low voice. Brando shook his head. "I don't know you, but you can put it that way. The Ebden I know should be Erwin's hero. He has been buried underground and returned to the embrace of Lady Martha. So he is you, but you are not him. Ebden snorted coldly and used his sword to support his body as he stood up from the ground with creaking sounds. You should have died a long time ago, young man, but you didn't. He replied, so it seems that you did not win by luck. You also know the past of this body. What do you want to know by telling me this? Seeing Ebden stand up, Freya was shocked. She knew how weak Brando was, but when she wanted to protect Brando, she was stopped by the Shire. She was startled, and the Shire shook his head. Although the young wizard didn't understand the relationship between his lord and the undead knight, he was sure that they knew each other. If so, with Brando's personality, he would not take the risk. Brendel was a little surprised by Ebden's answer, but he hesitated for a moment and decided to use his experience in the game to test it out. You asked me if I'm of royal blood, so what if I answer you right now? The undead knight sneered. Brando couldn't help but sigh. Seems like there are some differences between this and the game. But at least this is more realistic than the Amber Sword. He couldn't help but laugh at himself. Looks like you're going to bring your secret to Master Marcia, Ebden. The young man sighed as he realized that there was no hope to trigger the mission. But this time, Ebden shook his head. Not necessarily. He said. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidien.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 91. This sentence was not meant for you, but I think you can do it. Ebden paused for a moment and raised its head to look at the young man. Brando sat on his horse with one hand on the reins. He hesitated for a while and did not answer. Ebden knew that Brendel would not fully trust it, but it did not mind. The undead knight raised its chest and placed its sword in front of its left knee. It knelt on its right knee and placed both of its hands on the pure silver gauntlets of the pale fawn. It chanted, "The two moons shine, the king sleeps in the valley. The shadow of the holly tree points to the northwest. The stars fade away, the power of the dawn." Brendel's expression did not change when he heard it. He rode past Ebden on horseback, then turned his horse around and circled back to Ebden. There were many puzzles like this in the game, but he was not an expert in this field. The two moons shine, of course, referred to when the two moons of Wonde appeared in the sky. The first thing he thought of when the king sleeps in the valley was the remains of the saint, but it could also be the tomb of one of the kings of Erwin. The shadow of the holly tree pointed to the northwest. Brando frowned. Erwin did not have any holly trees. Was it just a metaphor? Or was it referring to a noble's emblem? But the holly tree represented the sacred in Wonde's heraldry. Just the emblem of Erwin alone had a holly tree on it. As for the disappearance of the stars and the descent of Dawn's authority, Brendel could not figure it out at all. Ebden purposely gave him some time to think. It saw Brando raise his head again and chanted, "The two-faced statue is silent. Have you forgotten the saint's oath? The emerald lake, the white mountain, the stone of the stone, the sword of the sword, wait." Brando suddenly raised his hand to stop it. He suddenly felt an inexplicable excitement. The sword of the sword. Could it be that Ebden was talking about the real Lionheart? The Lionheart sword was a sword passed down from generation to generation in the family of the first king of Erwin, the merciful Yak. However, the Lionheart sword was not only the symbol of the Leo dynasty, it was also one of the four sacred relics of Cruz. But ever since King Eric brought it out of the Empire, it became the symbol of the Erwin royal family. However, it was widely known that the Lionheart sword had long been lost during Erwin's civil war. Every subsequent king who succeeded to the throne wielded a replica. However, only a limited number of people knew about this secret. Once it was revealed, it would cause a huge uproar. Back then, Brando only learned about this after Erwin had perished. If Ebden was referring to the Lionheart sword, then the second part of the riddle made sense. The Saint's Oath should be referring to the Holy Knight's oath that Yak swore on the Lionheart sword, to lead the people of the Southern Empire away from the arrogant and greedy nobles. He rose up against them, and that was where the benevolence in his title came from. However, what did the Emerald Lake, the White Mountain, and the stone within the stone mean? Brando couldn't help but feel puzzled. It was said that the real Lionheart sword had the power to control the rise and fall of a kingdom. It seemed to be the truth as well. Ever since Erwin lost the real Lionheart sword, each generation declined and eventually died. However, Brando didn't believe in this saying. The rise and fall of a kingdom was linked to a sword. No matter how legendary the sword was, it was just a way to shirk responsibility. However, he was curious about the legend of the sword and why it was so popular in the stories of bards. According to the forums, the sword was at least a gold-tier weapon. Thus, he couldn't help but ask, what is the Emerald Lake? Unexpectedly, Ebden shook his head, I don't know either. But I often think about it and remember these two sentences. There is even a sacred oath that binds me. But I don't know where these memories come from and why they are so pervasive. Not every undead likes to remember. Brando replied. He suddenly felt that Ebden wasn't a simple person when he was alive. At least, in his memories, Ebden had nothing to do with the royal family. I'm a little special, and I know this myself. Ebden replied. The undead knight adjusted his helmet and continued, most undead that live in the darkness have intelligence, but I'm different from them. That's why I don't trust them. But when I see you, young man, I feel that you might be able to help me solve this mystery. Brando didn't reply. He felt that Ebden's words seemed to be true, but he wouldn't believe it easily. He was thinking about the Emerald Lake, the White Mountain, and the stone within the stone. He suddenly noticed that the two-faced statue didn't say anything, and he couldn't help but shiver. The statue didn't say anything. Could it be referring to the stone sage in the basin south of Ranner? The more Brando thought about it, the more he felt that it was possible. If the revelation came from the stone sage, then it would be a little troublesome. He would need the sage slate to make the stone sage speak. But where would he get the sage slate from? The nearest sage slate should arrive in Bragg's half a month later. The black market price was 500,000 tor, and it wasn't a small sum. The only consolation was that the stone sage was in the same direction as what he was going to do next. This would save him a lot of time, and Brando really didn't have much time left. He sat down on his horse and asked, "That's all you want to say?" Ebden nodded, "I have one more request." "Speak." Brando looked back. Under the command of Reto and Mano, the battle in the valley was nearing its end. Ebden took off the badge on his chest and said, "I hope to die like a real knight, or at least let my sword and armor accompany me forever." This badge is called the Lion Badge, and it has powerful magic power. It has no meaning to me now, so I'll pass it to you. Also, this is my pouch, there are some things in it that might be useful to you. Brando knew that if he was willing, he could also obtain the Pale Fang. He originally wanted to give the sword to Freya. However, he looked at the White Knight and nodded in the end. Both of them knew that an oath was meaningless compared to a dead person and a living person, so it was better to trust each other's promises. The reason why Ebden said so much to him was probably because he trusted him. Based on this point alone, Brendel would not go back on his words. Of course. Ebden must die, and the refugees will not allow a high-ranking undead general to be with them. Brando took the badge and glanced at it. There was a lion's head engraved on the brass surface, Lion Badge, Conflict Aura +1. Brendel almost dropped the badge from his hand. Conflict Aura was the core skill of a holy knight. It could be trained up to level 29, and could only be trained up to level 10. It increased 1 point of defense at the beginning, 0.5 point of defense for every level before level 10, 1 point of defense for every level after level 10, and 1 point of defense for every level after level 20. It increased exponentially. At level 21, Conflict Aura would increase defense by 2, at level 22 it would increase defense by 3, and so on. Originally, this skill could increase defense by 10 points when it reached level 29. However, with the addition of an additional level, this badge would increase defense by 11 points. What kind of concept was 11 points of defense? It was almost equivalent to 14 mm of frontal armor, which was almost equivalent to 3 sets of full-body plate armor. Brando immediately decided on his development path as soon as he received the badge. He would become a Templar Knight. He also knew that there was a full-body armor with a +1 Conflict Aura skill, and a Lion Shield with a +1 Charge Aura skill. With this combination, he would have an additional 40 defense after becoming a Templar Knight. It would be like a moving fortress, and it was not just him. In this era, all the soldiers within 60 feet of him were like tanks. What would it be like to charge on the battlefield? Brando suddenly remembered that Ebden had a full-body armor. It was no wonder that it was known for its terrifying defense among the 4 Knights of the Apocalypse in the later stages of Madara. Ebden the Conqueror, as expected of the Conqueror Ebden the Conqueror. Although his heart was in turmoil, he did not show it on his face. After going through so many life and death situations, Brendel felt that he was more mature than before. If this was in the game, who knows how much he would be proud of getting such a badge. He kept the badge and opened the other party's pouch to take a look. However, he soon found that the White Knight's collection was not rich. There were only some low-level materials in it, and the most valuable was a few pieces of adamantine, which was the material for making full steel armor. It seemed that the future 4 horsemen of the Apocalypse had already begun to make plans. It also knew the power of this badge. Brando could not help but look at the other party. "Do you have any other requests?" he asked. Ebden shook its head. "Please do it." Brando knew that if he let it die here alone, it would be a disgraceful thing. A knight on the battlefield would at least die in the hands of the enemy and return to the embrace of the earth. He did not have time to let Ebden return to the earth, but he could at least fulfill its first wish. The Shire pulled out his sword and walked forward, but Brando stopped him. His forehead was covered in cold sweat as he pulled out the elven sword and exchanged glances with Ebden. Then he rode his horse forward and stabbed the sword into the other party's chest. Ebden cracked a smile, and the flames in its eye sockets flickered. "I've told you so much with my memories, young man. Because I'm still Madara's Ebden until the moment of my death. Perhaps I should thank you for freeing me," the undead knight sighed, "but at the same time, I died as a dark noble. The eternal death of Madara, the symbol of immortality. I just did not expect to lose." The soul fire in its eye sockets eventually dimmed. The White Knight, Ebden, was finally dead. Brando knew that from this moment onwards, there was no more Madara's 4 Knight of the Apocalypse. He looked at the remains of his opponent in silence. Then, he watched as the silver light that filled the sky rose from the remains and merged into his body. It was as if a warm power had soaked into his body. He had never felt this when he absorbed experience before, but Brando understood that this was power, the pure power of the soul. He had obtained a total of 1,300 experience points from killing this commander who was over level 30. Adding the total experience points from the previous battles, he had obtained close to 2,000 experience points in the past few hours after killing Zasser. It seemed like it was more than enough to level up, but Brando did not do so. He suppressed the urge and knew that it was time for him to accumulate more experience points. After all, he still had a lot of things to do after the war ended. He raised his head to look at the sky. At this moment, the dark clouds dispersed, revealing the cross-shaped constellation behind him, shining brightly in the dark sky. The Knight's Throne. Then he raised the white deer statue in his hand and saw the beautiful creature showing its figure from the side of the mountain. It then turned around and disappeared in the northeast direction. Brando turned around and saw Reto riding his horse over. There are a lot of zombies on the mountains on the left and right. Reto said in a low voice. I understand. There's not much difference in time. Brando replied calmly, so let the refugees get on their way. In other words, we don't have much time to waste. P.S. As for the issue of update time, it's usually updated at night. To be continued. If you want to know the future, please go to www.chidien.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 92. How bold of him to call himself a member of the royal family. Her Royal Highness gently tucked her silver hair behind her pointy ears with one hand. She picked up the white porcelain teacup, took a sip, and smiled. But the two moons shine together, and the king sleeps in the valley. What do you think this riddle means, Lord Oberway? She pondered for a moment, and her silver eyes flashed as she asked. Most of the noble families in the kingdom have their own hidden treasures, and this is not an unknown fact. But Ebden mentioned an oath with the royal family, so this treasure must be related to the royal family. Oberway thought for a while and replied. I think it is not that simple, Lord Oberway. The saint's oath might be related to my ancestor, Eric. Oberway nodded. The Emerald Lake, the White Mountain, should be referring to Radnor's goddess lake. I heard that it is the resting place of a saint. I see. Do you have any other theories? The local fishermen often say that they see a knight of the lake in the fog, guarding the center of the goddess lake. Some people have seen an island with a white rock on it, and it must be the White Mountain. Thank you for telling me this, Lord Oberway. But what is the double-faced stone statue? I do not know, Princess Griffin. That's true. The desire for the mysterious treasure is mostly due to the unknown. This must be the joy of the knight's story. She covered her mouth and laughed. I'm sorry for making a fool of myself, Lord Oberway. It's nothing, Princess Griffin. I am also wondering who Ebden was when he was alive. Because there is no one called Ebden who was a knight of the royal family. Oberway replied. Ebden might not be called Ebden when he was alive. Griffin thought for a while and replied. I think so too, Princess Griffin. Oberway bowed. Griffin stared at the middle-aged man. She was sure that he must have done his research. She could not help but think that if this important official of His Majesty values the young man so much, it must be because of His Majesty's intentions. What ability does he have that you value? Is it his personal ability? Part of the reason, but not all of it. Most likely, he had taken a fancy to the power behind the young man. The princess could not help but touch her lower lip with her finger. Is the Highland Knight really that important? Can it really restore Erwin's glory? Unlike the local nobles and the royal faction, she believed that the kingdom needed a new force to revitalize it. But where was this new power? Highland Knight? Militia? Or the garrison? It didn't look like it. He kept feeling that there was something missing. The half-elf girl thought of that young man and shook her head. It wasn't him either. She even vaguely felt a trace of danger. She was slightly startled by the young man and felt a trace of astonishment. Could it be that he was jealous? The girl hurriedly shook her head. Your Royal Highness. Oberway noticed the princess's absent-mindedness. I'm sorry, Lord Oberway. Please continue. Oberway looked at her strangely and nodded. The first moon set in the west, and the second moon shone in the sky. Fog gradually rose in the Abbey's forest, and the fog in the mountains had a trace of coldness. Brando held the reins with one hand and looked around on the horse's back. He confirmed that the white stag was gradually bringing them east into the lowlands. A few minutes ago, Redo came to him to tell him that Marcus and his zombie army had stopped chasing them. It was not surprising that they had noticed that their power was gradually declining. The valley was completely silent. Two majestic colossi of more than 30 meters in height suddenly appeared in front of everyone in the valley through a thin layer of fog. Even Freya and the other mercenaries could not help but look up at the lifeless boulder and did not say a word for a long time. Who would have thought that there would be such a scenery behind the desolate valley? Through the thin layer of fog, it was as if their eyes had seen through the shackles of 1,000 years and landed on the boulder covered with the dust of history. For a moment, there was an inexplicable sense of heaviness in their hearts. The colossi were wearing robes, armor, and skirts. They wore elven pointed helmets with wings on both sides before the age of the sages. They held a spear in one hand and a giant shield in the other. They looked straight ahead. It was the appearance of the holy warriors in most myths. According to legend, each of these warriors came from the Golden Race. They followed the Azure Knight to fight the Twilight Dragon on the earth during the Dark Age and finally freed Wone from the clutches of darkness. In other words, they were the guardians of all intelligent creatures. The refugees and mercenaries entered from the foot of the colossi. They suddenly felt a sense of cleansing in their hearts, as if all the dirt and exhaustion had been washed away. They felt refreshed. Many people even stopped to check if they were hallucinating. Brando looked at these people. He did not tell them that this was actually Wone's most powerful protective barrier, the 10 Laws Decree. In fact, the effect of this barrier was more obvious for people with stronger dark powers. Ordinary people who passed through this barrier would enjoy purification and recovery spells. But for evil beings like Marcus and the White Knight Ebden, once they passed through this barrier, they would immediately be converted from extreme evil to extreme justice. However, if they wanted to experience this effect as undead creatures, they would first have to pass through the test of the 14-ring lightning strike spell at the tip of the two colossi spears. It was a divine spell. Not to mention Marcus, even the 24 eternal dukes of Madara would be turned into ashes if they came here. After passing through the colossi at the entrance of the valley became wider and wider. In the end, it formed a flat valley floor. Looking from both sides, there was a vast expanse of white fog, and there was no end in sight. There seemed to be some kind of creature in the fog. The white fog billowed, sometimes forming an angel with wings flying in the sky, a tall knight, or a fierce griffin, but in the blink of an eye, they disappeared. In this strange valley, no one dared to be too far away from Brando. The refugees consciously stopped talking, nervously looking at the strange scenery around them. Freya felt more and more incredulous as she stood behind. This place did not look like a mysterious place that ordinary people would understand. But when she looked at Brando, she was not surprised. She could not help but worry about her gains and losses. Brando was so mysterious. Although they were fighting side by side now, she was worried that one day, an ordinary girl like her would not be able to catch up to him. She could not help but frown and look at the Roman, although she did not say it out loud. But in her heart, she knew that the Roman's aunt must have her own secrets. Perhaps it was this kind of Miss Merchant who was worthy of Brando. They were the same kind of people. The more Freya thought about it, the sadder she felt. In the end, she could not help but hang at the back with her head lowered. Brando did not notice the little girl's thoughts, because he was answering the Roman's strange questions. For example, "Where is this place, Brando? Didn't I tell you before? This is the place where the holy saints' remains are. But you didn't tell me where the holy saints' remains are." Brando could not help but feel a headache. He turned around and saw the Shire's serious face. He knew that this guy was definitely not reliable at this time. He then looked at the merchant lady who was sitting on the horse's back. She was dirty and covered in mud from head to toe. There was nothing he could do about it. After all, this young lady had secretly gone to learn how to ride a horse. When Brendel found out about this, he was almost scared to death. He was afraid that his little Romaine would accidentally fall and injure herself. He did not expect that when he ran over to take a look, the Roman actually took a bundle of rope and tied herself to the horse's back. She even ran over to him to show off. In the end, she was naturally scolded by Brando, so that she would know what she could and could not do in the future. The place where the holy saints' remains are the ancient kings' and sages' resting place. They used their spirit to open up a territory and called it their country. Here, all their people are protected, and outsiders will be lost forever. Brando answered. Does that mean there are many places like this, Brando? The Roman's little face was full of curiosity. Half of her body leaned over and asked curiously. Of course. Brendel sniffed, and his eyebrows almost furrowed into a bowl. He made up his mind to let this little brat take a bath when they were out of danger. Which girl could stand the smell of mud all over her body? Sometimes, he really wanted to open up the merchant lady's head to see what was inside. They are all called the Holy Saints' remains. When they were talking, the others could not help but come closer. After all, it was such a magical place. Everyone wanted to hear the young man's opinion. However, these mercenaries were a little curious. This knowledge was not something that ordinary people could come into contact with. Some of them had seen a lot, and it could be said that their knowledge was not much less than the average noble. But they also did not know a lot of the terms that the young man mentioned. They only heard that the young man was a Highland knight. Were the Highland knights really that mysterious? However, in reality, they did not know. Not only them, but even the Shire was a little confused. After all, as an apprentice, his knowledge was not omnipotent. The Holy Saints' remains was related to ancient legends. In this aspect of knowledge, there were not many wizards in the Black Tower who were proficient in it. As far as the Shire knew, there were probably no more than 5 people who knew more about it than Brando. Then, where did his lord's knowledge in this aspect come from? The Shire had some doubts in his heart, but he did not ask. After all, at least as far as he knew, people who could see and use the cards of fate were not simple people. Brando listened to the Roman's question and shook his head. Of course they have their own names. Every Holy Saint's remains is related to the king who hibernated there. Just like this valley of mist that is everywhere and located in the lowland swamps. As far as I know, it is called the Home of Fairies. Home of Fairies. The Night King was one of the 11 kings. Long before the Flame King Gretel, he was the guardian of humans. He had an agreement with the Fairy Queen. The Fairy Queen let him eat the golden apple and become the king of humans. After his death, his soul returned to the Utopia and rested here, continuing to fulfill the promise. This is a place where time is chaotic. Compared to the outside world, the night here tends to be stagnant. Only during the day will time flow again. Legend has it that there is a golden apple tree in this valley. The Fairy Queen lives under the golden apple tree, but no one has ever seen her. Of course, if a mortal sees her, they will never be able to leave. He turned his head and saw the Roman staring at him with her clear black and white eyes, her face clean. Golden apple? Don't tell me that's all you heard. Brando's mood was instantly ruined, and he could not help but ask in annoyance. The merchant girl nodded seriously. All right, little Roman, I won't talk to you about this anymore. He almost couldn't catch his breath. But just as he was about to reason with the merchant girl who did not understand the situation, he suddenly froze and turned his head in a direction. Everyone turned their heads and followed Brando's gaze. They saw a lone tree. What is this? Brando was stunned. P.S. Does everyone feel like they are watching a fairy tale? To be continued. If you want to know the future, please go to www.chidian.com. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 93. Everyone was stunned when they saw the lone tree. Brando had just mentioned the golden apple tree, and they naturally thought of that. The mercenaries immediately thought of what Brando had said, that the legendary fairy queen lived under the golden apple tree, and that mortals who saw her were destined to never walk out of this valley. They could not help but shudder. These people could not help but look around instinctively, afraid that they would be trapped here forever if they were not careful. It was not easy for them to escape from Madara's undead army, and they were not going to be alone here for the rest of their lives. But what they did not expect was that Brando was not worried about the golden apple tree at all. In his previous life, players like him had already searched the entire valley. What seemed like a mysterious valley in the eyes of others was no secret to him at all. From here to the other side of the valley, there was nothing but bare ground and fog. There was not even a single strand of hair. There were no monsters, no treasures, nothing alive, and not even a trace of life. As for the legendary golden apple tree and the fairy queen, they were even more illusory things that were only passed down in myths by NPCs, and players had never seen them before. But what surprised him was the lone tree. He confirmed again and again that there was no such tree in the game. He had walked back and forth in this valley many times, and he should not have remembered wrongly, because everything in the valley was the embodiment of the king's idealization. Even if it changed during the day, it would return to its original state at night. Brando remembered clearly that unless there was a change in the valley's plot or the flow of time, the scenery would not change accordingly. But there should not be any quests in this valley. Could it be that the fairy home that existed in everyone's vision at this moment was not the one in the game? Brando immediately had a guess. Unless someone was hiding his experience, or the fairy home had changed before the players entered. But which should it be? The former seemed possible, but if one thought about it carefully, one would find it suspicious. For players, it was often difficult for one person to discover all the secrets of a place, so even if the first person was hiding something, the probability of everyone thinking the same thing was not high. But then Brando thought that it could not be ruled out that one person had repeatedly come here. Although it seemed a little idealistic, it was not impossible. He recalled that the first person to discover this valley should be the theologian of the Stellar Guild, a player called Clan War. The second person to enter was a knight, and the third was a female player from KOK. But the time between the three of them was only a few days apart, so the possibility of them hiding something was not high. Brando shook his head. That was not the reason. Then it was the second reason. This valley had changed before the players entered. This is not impossible in the game, but there are also two factors in this aspect. One was the plot change, and the other was the NPC exploration. He couldn't help but frown. If there were no players involved, he wouldn't know much about this quest. The unknown was a big problem for him. But Brando stared at the tree, and his heart could not help but become interested. Like every player, the pursuit of secret missions was innate, just like an unknown treasure that attracted people to chase after. A mission that involved ancient knowledge would not be too ordinary, right? He immediately gestured to the others, asking them to stop the refugees. Anyway, the time in the valley stopped at night. This night would last for 3 days and 3 nights, and he would have time to explore the valley before they ran out of food. In fact, the valley was only so big that it would only take a few hours for a horse to go back and forth. It would not take 3 days at all. He saw Reto looking at him in confusion, so he pointed at the tree and replied, "There seems to be some problems. I have to go ahead and check. Do you need help?" Reto, the bar owner, was a veteran of the November War, but he was helpless in the face of mysterious things. He could only rely on his own experience to ask. Brando did indeed need help. But he looked at the mercenaries and did not trust them. After all, this might involve some legendary treasures and the same danger. He did not want to share secrets with these people. He had to find someone he could trust. He first looked at the Shire. Originally, this young mage squire was his best choice. As a summoned creature, he could almost share secrets with this young man. Unfortunately, the Shire had used up all his mana in the night's battle, and now he was only slightly stronger than an ordinary person. He then looked at the Roman. This merchant lady was not qualified. Although she had sharp senses, she was too weak to follow him into danger. The Roman looked at him and blinked her eyes obediently. Brando knew that the merchant lady was pretending to be obedient so that he could take her on the adventure, but Brando would not be fooled. He finally turned his head and his eyes fell on the absent-minded Freya. Freya. Ah. Ah. Freya raised her head and looked at him. She was stunned for a moment and her face turned red. What's wrong? Brando looked at her and was stunned. In his original impression, Freya was a girl who had her own opinions. But why did she give off a strange feeling ever since they came to Sevale Mountain Path? If it was not for the elven sword not reacting to her, Brando would have suspected that she was replaced by Madara's undead. No, nothing, Brando, what's the matter? Freya had just thought of Brendel's strange request, and her heart was in a mess. She was afraid that he would see through her thoughts. I want to take a look at the front. Come with me. Freya was stunned for a moment and immediately nodded, okay. I want to go too. The merchant lady twisted around on the horse's back. You stay here obediently. If you want to learn how to ride a horse so badly, I'll let the Shire teach you. But if I come back and see you tied to a horse, I'll drag you over and tie you horizontally behind my horse. Brando looked at her and said fiercely. But I can't learn it. Roman answered bluntly. Can't you be a little more humble? Brando could not help but shake his head. It's okay, we have a lot of time. Riding a horse is a very simple thing. You have to go on an adventure with me. You can't not ride a horse. It's okay, Brando. I can tie myself to a horse. I don't feel uncomfortable. The merchant lady thought for a moment and answered seriously. It has a lot to do with whether or not you feel comfortable has nothing to do with it. Brando glared at her. He was too lazy to pay attention to the complaints of the future merchant lady. He simply ran to Reto's side and told him what to pay attention to. He then took a spare crossbow and called Freya to set off. In Brando's memory, the most likely plot in this valley was the western side road. But the more hidden the place was, the more the players would search for it. In fact, Brando had been there once or twice, but in the end, he did not find anything. But he still remembered every blade of grass, every tree, every mountain, and every rock in that area. The two left the party. Brando was constantly paying attention to the surrounding scenery. After letting the horse run for about 10 minutes, he finally confirmed his guess. The home of fairies was definitely different from the game. There must have been some unknown changes in the next few months. But seeing him circling around a rocky area, Freya, who was behind him, was puzzled. She could not help but ask, Brando, what are you looking at? I'm looking for the entrance. Brando was constantly turning his horse to look outside a messy white boulder. At this time, he seemed to have found something and suddenly flipped off his horse and walked towards the rocky area. The entrance? Freya followed and asked as she got off her horse. Yes. It's here. Follow me. Brando answered as he pulled out the elven sword and walked step by step towards a narrow gap between two sharp boulders. He remembered that this place was called the Fork of Fate. There would be a prompt in the system log when he reached this point in the game, but there was no prompt in this world. He could only rely on his experience. He remembered that there should be an open metal box behind the boulder. There was a stone slab in it. The stone slab was a necessary item to enter the Fork of Fate, but it could not be brought out of this valley. Someone had tried to put it in a multi-dimensional bag and bring it out, but it still mysteriously disappeared in the end. It could only be explained that the stone slab was an idealized part of this world in the first place. With that in mind, he circled around the boulder, but did not expect to be met with a gust of wind. Brando's senses were quite sharp now. Before his brain could react, his body had already reacted instinctively. He took a step back and crashed into Freya. In the next moment, a golden arrow flew past his nose. The two of them fell backwards, but Brendel raised his head at the last moment, only to see a golden figure disappearing behind the rock. If not for his quick reaction, he would not have been able to see where the attack came from. Who? Brando subconsciously wanted to get up from the ground and chase after the attacker. But when he put his hand down, he suddenly felt something soft. After a moment of shock, he finally reacted and could not help but blank out. Can't I? He turned around and saw that his hand was placed on the girl's chest where it should not be. Freya was completely stunned. Her bright brown eyes stared at him, and for a moment she did not know what to say. But the future Valkyrie finally reacted. She pushed Brando aside and quickly got up. She lowered her head and did not say a word. Brando also reacted. He could not help but awkwardly get up and pretend to look in the direction where the golden figure retreated. Of course, there was no ghost in that direction. I'm sorry, that. He thought for a long time and squeezed out such a dry sentence. Well, who was it just now? Freya lowered her head. Her face was so red that it looked like it was going to drip blood. I don't know. I saw a golden figure. Fairies don't look like that. It's more like a summoned creature. Brando's thoughts became much clearer when he asked about his field of expertise. You're not hurt, right? The girl's voice was as soft as a mosquito. Brando looked at her and shook his head. He paid special attention to the golden arrow from before, but he only found a deep hole on the side of the rock. Light arrow. Brando looked at the small hole and frowned. That's the effect of a high-grade weapon. But at least he was sure that what he saw was not an illusion. And from the opponent's speed, it seemed that the opponent was not as strong as Ebden. Thinking about this, he relaxed a little. As long as he stayed alert, there shouldn't be too much trouble. He had already confirmed his strength after the battle with Ebden. If he went all out, he could barely reach silver rank, and he was not too afraid of enemies below silver rank. After checking the battlefield, Brando gestured to Freya to stay alert. Then he grabbed the elven sword and sneaked in. He remembered that the golden figure escaped from the crack in the north. Behind that crack was the entrance to the Fork of Fate. Could it be that they came from there? But he had never heard of anyone being attacked in the game. He immediately saw the iron box behind the rock. It was on a white stone platform, as if it was placed there by someone. If there was a power that surpassed gold rank, it could destroy the box. But it was pointless because it would automatically return to its original state the next night. Brendel looked to his left and right. He did not dare to believe his previous memories. At the very least, the golden silhouette had changed something in his memory. Not only were there living creatures here, but they also seemed to be hostile. After confirming that there were no enemies around, he opened the box. But when he opened the box, he could not help but be stunned. Other than a stone tablet, there was also a pair of earrings in the box. What is this? Brando hesitated. He was afraid that there might be a magic trap on the box. Although there were no magic traps in the game, who could be sure? But he had a simple way to test it. He put the elven sword close to the box. There were usually some simple protective measures between enlightened magic items. He just needed to see if there was any reaction. Although this method did not work all the time, it was better than nothing. Brando quickly got the result. There was no reaction. He picked up the earrings and glanced at them. He immediately threw them back as if they were scalded. Endless ice earrings. Intelligence +2, will +1. Brando could not help but groan. He subconsciously covered his head. At this moment, he had a splitting headache. It was as if 1,000 needles were stabbing his brain. Brando. Freya was shocked and quickly ran to support him. I'm fine. Be careful. Brando held onto the metal box with one hand and gasped for breath. At the same time, he cursed the person who put the earrings here. Of course, he knew that there was something wrong with him. It wasn't a trap, but purely because the magic recoil was too intense. Of course, the biggest problem was that this ring was at least a 95-ounce equipment. How could it appear in such a place out of nowhere? His first reaction was that he was hallucinating. His second reaction was still impossible. Bocce was still a beginner's area at this time. Most of the players were not above level 50. This ring was far beyond what the players could handle. It was at least level 70. Thus, when Brando used his will to search for the ring, there was a strong magic backlash. It made his mind blank for a moment. And such a powerful magic item appeared in a low-level area. Logically speaking, there should not be such a flaw in the game. Perhaps there would be some changes in this world, but Brando did not believe that it would be the opposite of the game's setting. He waited until his headache subsided. When he calmed down, he realized another problem. What if the Land of the Saints' remains was designed to be completed by NPCs? The more he thought about it, the more he felt that it was possible. After all, this valley was first discovered not long after the game started, which was about 2 months after the end of the First War of the Black Roses. If this place was empty at that time, it meant that the designers did not intend for players to participate in the story. Brando could not help but wait for the earrings. His heart thumped. A hidden mission above level 60. Was he going to take advantage of the situation? Or was he going to leave as soon as possible? The risk was unimaginable, but the reward was also unimaginable. In his previous life, Brando had only completed 3 hidden missions above level 60. One of them gave him a fantasy weapon, one of them gave him an intermediate skill, and one of them gave him nearly 100 million Tor. With the experience of these 3 missions, he was able to enter the upper echelons of players. But how big was the risk? Level 60 was like a guillotine placed in front of Brando. At level 60, he had the strength of gold, and even his elemental activation was more than 10 levels higher. If he were to face a level 60 monster, it would probably kill him with a single glance. Brando placed his hand on the metal box. He could not help but feel agitated. He hesitated for a while, but still could not make up his mind. There was another key problem. In the next 3 months, everything in this valley might disappear at any time. It was possible that if he gave up on this risk today, he would not have the chance to choose again tomorrow. For a moment, this dilemma lingered in his mind like a cold ghost, urging him to take the risk again and again. What should he do? The young man could not help but take a deep breath and look at Freya. Brando. Freya saw the strange look in Brando's eyes and could not help but ask carefully. If I choose to take the risk, are you willing to come with me? Brando asked with a hoarse voice. I might, but I don't want you to take the risk, Brando. Freya thought for a while and answered. Brando hesitated for a moment, then nodded and let out a long sigh. P.S. 5,200 words to make up for yesterday's failure. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 94. As soon as Freya spoke, Brando knew what she was thinking. But he calmed down. He had experienced 3 hidden quests above level 60 and knew more. He did not want to risk his life for one of them. He had used all his strength to fight against Ebden, and he would definitely die if he faced a character above level 60. He also thought of another problem. After the First War of the Black Rose ended, Madara's army slowly retreated from Erewhon in the following month. The undead's control of this area lasted until mid-August. Before that, this area was practically uninhabited. The undead would definitely not explore this valley. Even if they wanted to, they did not have the ability to do so. The 14-ring lightning strike at the entrance was enough to make them retreat. This meant that he still had a lot of time to use until mid-August. Thinking of this, he took the earring and walked back. He patted the girl's shoulder and said, "Let's go back. Brando. There are still many opportunities to take risks, but Freya and I only have one life each." Brando smiled. "You're right, I had some mental problems just now." He sighed again. He knew that it was because he felt that time was too tight. The War of the Black Rose ended at the end of July. The civil war in Erewhon began in September, and then the coup in November. Even if he counted from now, he only had 5 months. Brando did not want to change history, but he wanted to protect Roman, Freya, and the others. At the very least, he needed to have the basic strength. It was because he knew that the world would become chaotic. Justice would be destroyed by the war. In order to survive in this chaotic world, he had to do something. Freya and Romain might not understand it, and even the people who followed him would not understand it. But sometimes he could not help but think that the prophet also had his own troubles. The feeling of helplessness when he knew what was going to happen, but was unable to change it, was much stronger than normal people. Freya blushed. "What did you say?" "Nothing," Brando replied. He sheathed his sword and walked out of the rocky area, motioning for Freya to follow him. Just as the two of them left, 2 people slowly walked out from the dark crevice between the rocks. One was tall, and the other was short. The taller one seemed to be a woman. She wore a strange white robe with blue feather patterns on her sleeves, chest, and shoulders. However, it was similar to the desert robes of the Quilodians. The waist was narrow, but the sleeves and trousers were unusually wide. She had a head of long silver hair, and her eyes were dark green like the deepish lake. There were 2 red lines on her face, but she didn't have much expression. She stared at the backs of Brando and Freya for a long time before she spoke. "Alas, you're not going to keep them." Her voice was neutral and flat, like plain water. "Fuluafa, you should keep your attacks hidden like your claws and teeth. Otherwise, it won't be fun." She heard an excited voice. The short girl was about 14 or 15 years old. Her long blonde hair was tied up in a pair of dazzling ponytails. She was wearing the traditional leather clothes of most adventurers, but she was carrying a heavy iron box as tall as a person on her back. If you looked at the iron box, you could see the pattern of 5 interconnected stars. Fuluafa thought for a moment. "Then why did you attack them, Alas? You're so boring, Fuluafa. That was just a small test. No wonder your power dropped by more than 98%. I was worried that there was something wrong with the law of gold. Fuluafa, I really don't want to marry someone as boring as you. Alas, we are dragons. Humans is just a reference. Forget it, I don't want to talk about this with you. That human man actually took your earring, Fuluafa. Doesn't he know what this means?" She snickered as she spoke. Fuluafa glanced at her and didn't answer this time. "Forget it, what a boring guy. But I really want to see their expressions when they see that little gift. I heard that humans are very greedy creatures. Aren't you here to find the legend of the golden fruit tree, Alas? Why did you give it to them?" You see, the legend of the golden fruit tree is not as interesting as the struggle of small creatures. I decided to give this adventure to these 2 little guys. Besides, I think that human man looks quite familiar. Maybe he has something to do with the King of Night. Fuluofa turned around and looked at her. Do you know the King of Night? Alaz immediately coughed. That's just a saying, Fuluofa. What are you planning? The long-haired girl asked indifferently. Nothing, just a small test. Alaz snickered again. Fuluofa frowned. When Leto saw Brendel and Freya coming back, they had already settled down the refugees and were preparing their meals. From afar, there was a small patch of smoke at the bottom of the valley that was shrouded in thick fog, adding a bit of liveliness to the place. After a night of battle, both the mercenaries and the militia were exhausted. When Brando rode through the crowd, he saw many people gathered in twos and threes and fell asleep. However, there were some refugees who took the initiative to bring food to the people who protected them. They shook the sleeping soldiers awake and then brought the steaming hot food to them. Brando saw this scene and couldn't help but feel a little relieved. It could be said that if it weren't for him, there wouldn't be a tenth of these people left. He changed the lives of these people, and these people changed more people. History was changed little by little like this. Although it was still very weak now, it was gradually gaining strength. Brando met the veteran of the November War, the boss of the Red Copper Dragon Story Club. The other party whispered to him if he wanted to depart immediately. But when Brando looked back, he saw the Shire and Sue sleeping soundly on a wooden box not far away. He then looked at the others. The whole camp was silent. He thought for a moment and shook his head. Anyway, his plan was already more than half completed. There was no need to push these people too hard. Time in Fairyland was infinitely close to stopping at night. As long as they waited until morning to depart, they could be ahead of Madara's army. After all, the exit to the north of the valley was almost at the river bank north of the Valley of Sharp Stones. Victory was already in sight. Have you rested, Uncle Redo? Brando asked. Sir, don't worry. I'm a mercenary. We are best at taking care of ourselves in this kind of environment. Redo patted his chest and smiled. Brando nodded. Then, Freya, you should go to sleep too. He turned back again and looked at the ponytailed girl who had not closed her eyes for days and nights. Although the holy words of cleansing had the power to restore physical strength, it could not make up for mental exhaustion. Freya quickly shook her head. I can still hold on, Brando. This is an order, Freya. Brando said. Freya could not help but widen her eyes. What did she want to say? She had to obey his orders. She should be the captain of the militia. But when she looked at Brando, and thought of the young man's heroic bearing as he led them through enemies 10 times, even 100 times their number, she could not help but be speechless. As if it was a matter of course, she could only lower her head and nod. I understand, she replied. Brando did not notice the softness in the future Valkyrie's tone. After watching her leave, he turned back and casually asked Redo, by the way, where is the Roman? The Roman lady just rode to the front of the group. Redo said as he glanced at the front of the group. His expression was as if he had just witnessed a miraculous scene. Ride a horse. Brando did not notice his expression and only asked in confusion. He wondered if that damned girl tied herself to a horse and went crazy again. He could not help but wonder if the future merchant lady had forgotten the pain because he did not teach her a lesson for a while. But before he could finish thinking, he heard a greeting from behind him. Oh, Brando, you're back. The nature of the voice made it obvious that it belonged to a careless young lady. He turned around just in time to see a certain merchant girl on horseback running around in front of him with a smug look on her face. Brando took a closer look. This girl actually learned how to ride a horse. How did you learn? It was his turn to be surprised. He could learn how to ride a horse in an instant because he had the game system as a cheat. But what was the situation with the Roman? Because the Roman is a merchant, the Roman stopped her horse in front of him and answered with a smug look. What does this have to do with being a merchant? It has nothing to do with it. The Roman was stunned and could not help but widen her eyes. But shouldn't all merchants know how to ride a horse? I have to say this, Miss Roman. Most merchants don't know how to ride a horse. Redo chimed in. The Roman's pair of small eyebrows frowned together. Is that so? It doesn't matter. The Roman is a more powerful merchant. Brando, am I right? Yes. Brando was too lazy to pay attention to her. He thought that this might be the so-called compensation from the heavens. Someone with an abnormal brain would naturally be more blessed by the heavens. It was probably the so-called fortune favors fools of principle. He glanced at her in annoyance, then dismounted and ordered, "Little Roman, since you are so free, accompany me to the camp for a walk." "Okay, Brando." The merchant lady looked very excited. "Do you need me to come with you, my lord?" Redo asked as he turned his horse around. Brendel did not spit out a mouthful of blood. He thought to himself, "Uncle, can you not be so eager to be a third wheel?" But he also knew that Redo had good intentions and could not refuse. He could only nod gloomily. But just as he dismounted, he suddenly felt something strange in his waist pouch. He was slightly stunned and opened it. It would have been better if he did not see it. His face suddenly changed as he subconsciously thought that he was hallucinating. He then closed his waist pouch and opened it again. Brando was convinced that he must have been hallucinating. How could he have such a thing in his waist pouch? I was too excited yesterday to write the first flight of the 4th generation. In order to celebrate today, I decided to go all out. This is the first update. By the way, I beg for monthly votes. I don't have many friends voting for me these days. Only 2 or 3 votes a day. Also, I beg for recommendation clicks. Last week, I barely made it to the recommendation list. This week, there is no list at all. Chapter 95. After listening to the story, the silver-haired girl was silent for a long time. She rested her chin on her finger and thought for a while. Then she turned around to look at the sun shining through the tall arched window. The sun outside was already leaning towards the west. "So what is the end of the story, Lord Oberway?" she asked. "The end is me telling the story to your highness." "Isn't the end obvious, your highness?" "That's true. But there is one more thing you haven't said, Lord Oberway." The princess asked with interest. "Oh. You said he obtained something good in the process. But, from the beginning to the end, I didn't hear you describe it in words," the half-elf girl asked. "Is that so, your highness?" "But I remember that I explained it very clearly." Oberway smiled and pretended to be surprised. "Lord Oberway, are you talking about the badge that Ebden gave him?" "It's just a magic badge. It can't be considered something good, right? I think with your knowledge, you shouldn't be talking about this." No, of course not. Your highness, why don't you think about it more carefully?" The silver-haired girl calmed down and pondered for a moment. "I think it's better to do it in the Valley of the Saints. I remember there was a part of the story that you described very briefly. I think the mystery is in there. Your intelligence is unparalleled, your highness." Oberway praised sincerely, but I didn't mean to be brief. At that time, I did feel 2 powerful auras lurking nearby, and I didn't dare to get close. I wanted to warn them, but I didn't expect to find out too late. Oh. Lord Oberway, although you are not known for your swordsmanship, I remember that you are a lower gold. There is someone who could make you not want to get close. The half-elf girl was slightly stunned. Almost. But fortunately, it seems that the two powerful existences didn't want anyone to discover them. They must have used some tricks to make them retreat. Oberway replied with lingering fear. If that's the case, that young man must have gotten something from the pouch. The princess thought for a moment. Yes, my lord, you haven't told me what he saw when he opened the pouch. Oberbeck had a look of admiration on his face. He looked around and mouthed something. The silver-haired girl was stunned after hearing this, and her expression changed slightly. That kind of thing, does it really exist? Oberway nodded. I've only heard of it in legends before, and I was just as surprised as you at that time. Unfortunately, once the kind of thing is touched by a mortal, it will no longer belong to a second person. It is indeed a pity. Otherwise, it might have been able to change my younger brother's personality. For Erwin, his personality is a little too soft. She looked at the important minister beside His Majesty and said, otherwise, no matter what, Lord Oberway will snatch it over, right? Oberway did not mind and nodded. Even if he is a friend of Everton's daughter, it is still the same. I'm afraid they're not just friends. The princess couldn't help but smile. Oberway looked at her and knew that she was reminding him not to have any ideas about her. The minister couldn't help but shake his head. He did consider using the only daughter of King Oberg VII to win over the Highland Knight. However, with the princess's strength, it seemed unlikely. But he looked at her and couldn't help but think that since she was a daughter of the royal family, she couldn't escape the path of marriage. In that case, the young man was actually a good candidate. At least, he was much better than many of the noble youths that he had seen before. Of course, he could only think about it. He lowered his head and said, since the story has come to an end, Your Highness, it's getting late. Please allow this old minister to take his leave. Lord Oberway, Lord, please. I still want to stay here alone for a while. Oberway looked up at the silver-haired girl and couldn't help but find it funny. He knew that the princess wanted to avoid her history teacher, Sir Panison, who was probably waiting for her in the side hall for the whole afternoon. Panison might even be planning to complain to His Majesty. Running away is not a good idea, Your Highness. He couldn't help but remind her softly. The silver-haired girl smiled and her silver-gray eyes revealed a trace of slyness, but at least it's away. The door closed. The princess was stunned for a moment. She sat on the chair and looked back at the dust floating up and down under the tall arched window. The golden sunlight seemed to weave a dream, and she couldn't help but think about it. What happened after that? The wind started to blow in the forest. A low breeze blew through the canopy like a stream of water, causing the thick fog to move slowly. Layers of white fog filled the air between the branches, contrasting against the clusters of fiery red berries on both sides of the forest. When the morning light was broken, the muffled sound of horse hooves came from afar. The steel-clad hooves crushed the shrubs and berries as they galloped past the sharp stones on the riverbank. The water splashed like white crystal pillars. There were a total of 34 horses galloping across the river. The skeletons in the river felt the tremors of the earth and got up. They were startled by the sound and looked around. However, just as they slowly turned their heads, the phosphorescent flames in their eye sockets reflected a warhorse that was getting bigger and bigger. They were all tall and handsome erect warhorses. Their powerful chest muscles and front hooves directly smashed and chopped these weak undead creatures into pieces, or sent them flying and crashing into the white rocks on the riverbank, shattering them into scattered bones. The cavalrymen broke through the scattered skeletons and gradually slowed down. Their steps became smaller and smaller. The young knight who was leading the cavalrymen suddenly raised his hand. Due to inertia, the 30 or so horses took 2 or 3 steps forward and stopped altogether. More than 100 hooves stopped in the middle of the stream, and the rapid current could only circle around them. A loud shout opened the curtains of the morning. We won! We won! Then there was a second shout. Long live! Long live Brando! When the horses stopped, they seemed to have realized something. The mercenaries on horseback raised their hands and cheered in unison, echoing throughout the valley. Amidst the cheers, Brando took off his leather helmet and threw it far away. He could not help but wipe the sweat off his cold forehead. The morning breeze brushed past, chilling his face. He wore a gray leather armor and sat upright on the horse's back. He raised his head to look at the green mountains around him and thought, "It's over, it's finally over." He clenched his fists. It had been a nightmarish battle. When they entered the Valley of the Saints from the wastelands, each of them had used up their last bit of strength. A mere 2,000 refugees slaughtered their way out of tens of thousands of undead creatures. It sounded like a fantasy story, but it happened. Perhaps some of them left, some of them were cold corpses lying on the ground, some of them were sad, some of them were crying, but most of them finally made it out, right? He turned around and saw that the mercenaries that Freya brought out from the red copper dragon's tail gathering were all injured, but they all looked at him with a look of conviction. They knew that he was the one who brought all of this to them. It was almost a miracle. But the young man in front of him did it. He said that he would use his sword to lead them to a miracle, and he did it. Freya brought the militia and chased after him. The first thing she said when she saw Brando was, "Brando, did we really win?" Brando looked at the heroic girl on the horse's back and nodded. He did not say anything, but the militia behind Freya quietened down. All of a sudden, the civilians, the defeated white-maned soldiers, and the defeated mercenaries all threw their weapons to the ground. They were stunned, they couldn't believe their ears. After a day and night of chasing, they won just like that. Even the white-maned army could not defeat the enemy, but they broke through their encirclement again and again. Someone could not help but ask loudly, "Sir Knight, did we really win?" Brando nodded. Long live! Long live! In an instant, the crowd cheered and jumped. They could not help but cry tears of joy. Some of them immediately turned and ran, they wanted to bring this good news to the refugees behind them. The riders looked at these excited people and could not help but smile without saying a word. Just a moment ago, weren't they the same? Brando saw Freya staring at him and could not help but ask, "What's wrong?" The ponytailed girl's face turned red. After days of fighting and managing the refugees, she had grown up quickly. She was no longer the naive girl from the countryside. She looked at Brando and could not help but wonder if the heavens had sent such an outstanding young man to their side to lead them out of their predicament. "Thank you, Brando." She lowered her head and replied softly. Brando smiled, but he looked up and stared blankly at the verdant mountains in the distance. He suddenly remembered that it was the stag forest. How nostalgic. When he went from Bragg's to Fortress Reedon, he passed through that forest. He remembered that there was a Wolverine area and an ancient castle. That castle was one of the places he had to go in the future. Speaking of which, it was time to make a plan. After a few days of fighting, he had accumulated close to 5,000 experience, but he could not use it all to level up. The most important thing was that activating the elemental pool required 2,000 experience. Brando had already discovered that the Card of Fate was a very useful magic item. Although he did not know why he had never heard of such a thing in the game, activating the elemental pool was a priority. Then there was the Scholar and Knight classes. The Scholar class was a secondary class that all players had to take. Not only could it expand the main class, it also provided a large amount of experience. The only problem was that the skills were too weak and it also took up a secondary class. A character only had 3 secondary classes. As for the Knight class, it was needless to say. Brando wanted to establish a good relationship with the Holy Cathedral of Fire in order to become a Knight of the Holy Cathedral. It was not until these 2 days that he realized that skills were rare in this world. However, he immediately realized that this was not because of the difference between this world and the game. It was because he had misunderstood. If he thought of the people in this world as NPCs, then everything would be natural. After all, only players had the main class skills. In this way, the many quests that he knew about to cultivate skills became a big advantage for him. Therefore, he had to put learning skills on the agenda. He could not help but think that perhaps the heavens had sent him here for a reason. This was because the south of Grimoires was indeed the war zone with the lowest intensity during the First War of the Black Rose. It looked like a beginner's area, allowing him to slowly familiarize himself with this seemingly old-fashioned but specious world. But even so, he was just about to complete his quest. In history, the Insurged Dragon used his third-rate army of necromancers, skeleton soldiers, pale knights, black warriors, ghosts and other low-level undead creatures to fight Aween to a standstill. It was also the beginning of the kingdom's decline. Brando had once scoffed at the decadent Erwin, but when he led this group of NPCs, he realized that war was not so easy. Sometimes, it was too biased to look at history from the perspective of a player. History had its inevitable inertia. When it was in the hands of the regent princess, perhaps she also found that she was a little helpless. But he did not know what Ober VII was thinking at this moment. After all, the decline of Erwin did not happen overnight. Brando recovered from his thoughts and could not help but let out a long sigh. In any case, he had at least won the current round. Since yesterday, they had wiped out the outermost part of Marcus' combat power. To be honest, compared to the battle on the first night, there was nothing worth mentioning. But as long as they moved forward, they would be at the northern edge of the Valley of Sharp Stones. So, this was a victory. Then he felt someone patting him on the back. He turned around and saw Reto. Badam, Uriel, Terran, and Mano were with the bar owner. He was stunned for a moment. Why were they together? My lord, do you have any plans? The first person to speak was Batum, who had always been rude and uncouth in Brendel's eyes. He had a striking reddish-brown beard, and it was impossible for Brendel not to remember him. Plans? We have all discussed it. If you are willing to take us in, we are willing to follow you. Mano looked at him and answered straightforwardly. These mercenaries had nothing much to say. They were all people who looked for food on the edge of the blade. After the past few days, they found that they were more willing to work under this young man. Brando was stunned for a moment and realized that these people were willing to be his retainers. But he was not a noble yet. His noble status was only supported by the Shire, a mage's retainer. But he thought for a moment and realized that he did need some people to work for him. So he pondered for a moment and replied. After today, it is not suitable for you to follow me at the moment. Everyone was stunned, but only Reto understood the hidden meaning in his words. Then what plans do you have, my lord? The bar owner asked. Brando looked at him. What plans do you have? They looked at each other. What surprised Brando was the security captain, Uriel, who answered, If my lord has other intentions, we plan to form a mercenary group. We have all fought side by side, and we trust each other. Uriel, you don't want to be the security captain anymore? He asked. Uriel smiled. No, I have thought it through. My brothers are all willing to walk this path. What about the others? Brando raised his head. Other than us, many of the refugees are also interested. After all, most of them have lost their homes. But the people of Fortress Reden have more thoughts. Other than that, most of the White Mane soldiers and mercenaries are willing to follow us. The rest are just some farmers. Badam replied. Brando couldn't help but look at him. He thought that this guy wasn't simple. He was able to find out the composition of the refugees. Of course, this was also related to Freya not guarding against them. Dragon subduing Pagoda, you too. Brando looked at the former officer of the White Mane Army. He was one of the backbone of the kingdom. He didn't believe that this person would have other thoughts. He didn't expect Dragon Subduing Pagoda to look at him. He thought for a moment and replied, "I only want to follow you, my Lord Knight. If you don't agree, I can only return to the White Mane Army." "Are you disappointed?" Brando asked after a moment of surprise. Dragon Subduing Pagoda nodded. "Then let's form a mercenary group and call it the Amber Sword," Brando replied. Everyone was stunned. Only Redo asked, "Then, my lord, what do you think?" "Think of a way to keep some of the craftsmen among the refugees." "Of course, you can't force them," Brando replied. "For your side, let Badam stay with me. I do need some people to do things." He turned his horse around and said to Dragon Subduing Pagoda, "If you really want to stay, then stay with Uncle Redo. I don't know what I can do for you, but I think you will know soon enough." Dragon Subduing Pagoda was stunned for a moment and slowly nodded. "Then where are you going first, my lord?" Gasol asked. "I'm going to Anzek. There are people waiting for me there. Then I'll go to Bragg's. If everything goes well, I think I'll be able to inherit a territory soon. Then we'll talk about the next problem," Brando replied confidently. Everyone couldn't help but look at each other. There were many nobles these days, but a knight with a territory was rare. It seemed that this young man was the legendary Highland Knight. For a moment, many of them felt like following the right person. Brando raised his head and looked at the mountains in the distance. The plan in his mind gradually became clear. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Translator, Endless Fantasy Translation Editor, Endless Fantasy Translation. Chapter 96. In the month of the astrologers, the beginning of each year was called the month of the winter harp. The winter harp ruled a person's charm, so January was the month of socializing. Most of the banquets and winter hunts were held in this month. June was called the month of hazy summer. Hazy referred to the moonlight of a summer night. It was the day when the magic of Wone recovered from the summer slumber. Therefore, the activities of the wizards became more frequent after this month. Both the living and the dead wizards. But in July, the month of flowing fire, the day when the sun walked on the earth. The sun god Perkin was in charge of power, so this month was the month of power. In the Far East, the orcs held their biggest celebration, the Festival of Flames. Similarly, for the kingdom under the protection of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, this was a crucial month. Erwin's annual ceremony, the Festival of Flames, should have started early this month. But in the Grimoires region, the farmers, nobles, and high-ranking officials were not in the mood to celebrate because of the continuous war since the end of May. But it seemed that the situation had taken a turn for the better. There were rumors in the countryside that the army formed by the terrible monsters in the south had stopped at Dragos and no longer moved north. Then there were rumors that the silver-winged cavalry had won 2 battles at the front lines and collected many war flags. But there were also rumors that they had defeated the silver-winged cavalry. In short, there were all kinds of rumors in the rear, making it difficult to distinguish between the truth and the lies. But thankfully, the people of the countryside were always willing to believe in the good things. Fortunately, Count Nakin of Bragg's castle was wise and mighty. Everyone praised him for this. On the 7th day, Insersta's army turned to Ranner, and the countryside of Grimoires calmed down once again. It was said that some people saw the end of the war because July was the day when the sun walked on the earth. The undead would burn as soon as they touched the ground, and the kingdom would naturally turn to counterattack. No one knew where this rumor came from, but it spread widely in the region in just a few days. Brando was sitting at a wooden table, listening to the conversation between a few farmers not far away. It had been 2 days since he and the others left Ankees and headed towards Bragg's along the main road. The front line was gradually becoming less tense, and the number of undead was decreasing. At least the farmers were right about one thing: the war was coming to an end. Martin brought the villagers of Butchie to Ankees, and when the news of the fall of Butchie reached Fort Vermeer, he naturally became a hero. Even Butchie's guards and militia were able to bask in the limelight. Freya and Romain were both on the list of commendations, but this was just the tip of the iceberg. Brendel knew that the main event had yet to come. After the war ended, the kingdom needed to create heroes. This was the best way to encourage the people. Wars were always about you fighting your own battles and me fighting my own battles. It didn't matter if you won or lost. As long as there was a bunch of flowers, that was enough. However, when they arrived at Ankees, Martin and his men had already been sent to Brugloss. The nobles were in a hurry to reap practical benefits. The guards and the militia needed practical rewards, while the nobles only needed to maintain the reputation of being a capable commander. There was no conflict between the two. Although Brando already knew that this title would eventually fall on the head of the White Mane Army, Count Pulla, when he thought about it in detail, it was nothing more than the infighting between the local nobles and the local army. However, there were two pieces of news that were out of Brando's expectations. The first was that Butchie's guards were not completely wiped out. He heard that Breton and his 2 deputies were still alive. When Brando thought of that hateful guy, he felt as disgusted as if he had eaten a fly. However, no matter what, as someone who had gone through thick and thin together, he faintly heaved a sigh of relief in his heart. The other piece of news was more meaningful. That was that the tiger Luc Besson was actually not dead. When Brando confirmed this piece of news, he felt as if he had been struck by lightning. He was neither worried nor relieved, but there was an inexplicable feeling of loss and gain. Did history change because of him? Damn it, these idiots. It was only Madara who changed the original intention of the attack. What does it have to do with those cowardly nobles? These people don't even know anything. Brando, who is Count Nakin? Freya could not help but complain softly. The young man looked up and saw the disdainful look on her face. Brando could not help but laugh. Count Nakin is the head of the Dragos family. This family is named after this place and has a long history. It is not something that ordinary nobles can compare to. The girl with a long ponytail was stunned when she heard this, and her confidence was halved. But he can't take everyone's credit. The purpose of those big shots is different from ours. We won't have anything to do with them. Brando smiled. Besides, you don't have to be angry with these farmers in the countryside. Of course, you look down on those nobles because you know what's in their bones. But these farmers don't know. In their eyes, the nobles are high and mighty, so it's natural for them to think this way. Freya was stunned for a moment, and then she remembered that she used to be the same. She thought that the people in the city were arrogant and knowledgeable, and the nobles were high and mighty. She could not help but look at the young man across the table. It seemed that after she met Brando, she had grown up little by little and understood a lot more than before. Those things that used to be unfathomable in her eyes seemed to be normal now. But what led to this change, or was Brando really that amazing? Brando saw that she was thinking and asked, "What are you thinking about?" "I'm thinking, have I changed?" "People change, Freya. But what's the difference between us?" The girl was slightly stunned and looked at him with her light brown eyes. Wisdom. Wisdom. Wisdom is that you see more than them and understand more. When you see more and understand more, the world will seem more ordinary in your eyes. Brando answered. What about you, Brando? Freya thought for a moment and could not help but ask the question that she had always wanted to ask. Compared to you, you can say that. But once you understand more, the world will become more complicated in your eyes. It will make you feel endless fear and trepidation. The young man thought for a moment and answered. Freya thought for a moment and slowly shook her head. Brando laughed. You will understand. But he immediately saw the merchant girl put her chin on the table and looked at him with a pitiful look. He could not help but lose half of his good temper. What are you doing now? He asked. Nothing. The Roman flatly denied. He was speechless for a moment. It had to be said that the young lady's jumpy thinking often made the young man unable to continue with his questions. Brando thought for a moment and could only change the topic. Speaking of which, since yesterday, what have you been writing? The Roman's eyes lit up. She sat up and answered, I've been calculating the price, Brando. Price? Because since the end of the month of the new moon, the price of food in Ankees has increased by more than 50%. If the war can last until winter, then the merchant girl, Roman, will be able to complete her first business deal. The future merchant girl answered logically. The Roman's words surprised both of them. 2 days ago, they saw the girl having fun in Ankees and thought that she was completing her adventure. Who would have thought that she had unknowingly completed her market research? However, Brando was surprised by the merchant girl's keen senses, while Freya was simply surprised that her good friend had such a serious side to her. Then it looks like you won't be able to complete it. Brando's interest was piqued, and he could not help but reply, the war will last until the middle of the 7th month. Miss Merchant, your first plan is going to be ruined. Really? The Roman couldn't help but ask. Most likely. Brando said in his heart. It should be 100%. However, he wanted to see the merchant girl's expression when she was hit, but he was quickly disappointed. Hey, Brando. The Roman blinked her eyes. I've heard that Braggs has been sending wine and food from Dragos, Ankees, and Butchie. Isn't that right? Ankees and Dragos have always been the most important grain-producing areas in the south of Grenoires, right? Brando couldn't help but look at the little Roman, thinking that she even knew about this. If that's the case, Braggs has a population of 35,000. Since they've entered a state of war, they should have stopped making wine at the end of May, right? If the nobles received the news in advance, I'm afraid it would have started at the beginning of May. Brando couldn't help but think. The signs of war were actually present in many aspects, but most people didn't notice it. The merchant girl counted with her fingers. If that's the case, if the war ends in the middle of July, Ankees wouldn't be able to hold enough wine for 2 days. I'm afraid that Ankees won't be able to support 2 celebrations. If Brugloss wants to concoct wine and food from the north, they will have to pass through the gray-faced Griffin mountain range. If that's the case, I'm afraid the price of wine in this area will be inflated. Brando was stunned and couldn't help but ask, who told you this? My aunt always said that if you ignore the experience of the elderly, you will be punished by the heavens. The Roman looked at the two of them with sparkling eyes and answered seriously, there's old John from the Manilon family, old Master Anton, and the lame Cavan. Roman people are very likable. Some of these old people have been making wine for Braggs for most of their lives. That's right. Brando, do you want the great Roman merchant to introduce you to one of them? They're quite powerful. Brando couldn't help but look at the cocky merchant girl. He believed that with her personality, she would be liked by many people. But what was a great Roman merchant? So you want to take advantage of the war to make a fortune? That's your plan? He asked. The merchant girl nodded like she was pounding garlic. Lack of money. The merchant girl continued to nod like she was pounding garlic. Wait, Freya stood up and frowned. Brando, don't tell me you want to go crazy with the Roman. We don't have much money left. Freya, maybe the little Roman will give us a surprise. However, Freya did not believe that a pie would fall from the sky. There are always some bad comments in the book review section. It's sad. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.cheatyin.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 97. Anyway, I won't agree to it. Before Freya could finish her sentence, she saw Roman's pitiful expression and swallowed her words. I am too lazy to care about the two of you. Brando knew that Freya was a soft-hearted person, so he had already emptied his pouch on the table. A few silver coins fell out, about 400 to 500 Tor coins. He was stunned for a moment. He did not expect that he only had so little money. He had received a small handful of low-grade gems from Ebden's loot and sold them for a good price in Ankees, worth tens of thousands of Tor coins. He divided the money into 3 parts and gave one to Roman and one to Freya for safekeeping. It was only then that he remembered that he had almost used up all the money he had to buy the evening primrose, fluorescent moss, and black mage materials. These 3 materials could be used to create a high-grade MP potion that could stimulate the will attribute for a short period of time. It was known as the Wizard's Berserk Potion. This was already a luxury item in the game, and it was probably even more sought after in this world. However, it was like the painting of the fairy princess, Dark Light, which was worth millions of Tor coins. It was an investment that would not yield any results in a short period of time. Especially that painting, he found that he could not get rid of it in a short period of time. He was now regretting letting the Shire handle this matter. If he had known, he would have just taken 1 or 2 gold and silver items. Treasures with obvious characteristics like this were not easy to sell on the black market, unless he could find a more private channel. However, Brando wanted to curse. He did not have such considerations when he was a player, and players did not have to consider the feelings of NPCs. He placed the money on the table one by one and sighed. Looks like this is all I have. But Freya should have some. Why are you dragging me into this again? Freya almost couldn't catch her breath. She glared fiercely at Brando, but she still took out the money bag. Damn it, all our travel expenses are in there. You can do whatever you want. There were about 4,000 Tor coins in the bag that Freya threw on the table. Brando was stunned and looked at her in surprise. It had been almost a month since they left the Dragos region. During this period of time, he, Roman, Badam, Tamar, and his son had all been taken care of by Freya. With 6 people, 4 horses, and the money to hire a carriage, Brando naturally thought that there wouldn't be much left of the travel expenses that he had given Freya. However, he didn't expect that there would be so much left. I didn't expect Freya to be so good at running a household, he couldn't help but think. What are you looking at? Noticing Brando's gaze, Freya was stunned. She couldn't help but lower her head to check herself. Did she wear the wrong clothes? Nothing, I just feel that Freya is very virtuous. I wonder who will be lucky enough to marry such a girl in the future. Brando looked at her and replied. Freya is Roman's. Roman laughed happily at the side. The girl with a long ponytail blushed as red as the sunset. Her heart couldn't stop thumping. What good fortune. What nonsense are you spouting? What nonsense are you spouting? She immediately glared fiercely at Roman, and Roman, shut up. Unfortunately, Romain had long since ignored the attack. She smiled and took out a bag of money that was as dry as Brando's. She shook the empty bag and replied, Roman doesn't have much money. Damn it, where's your money? Freya was stunned and couldn't help but ask. Previously, Brando had divided the money equally into 3 portions, but logically speaking, Romain should be the one who didn't need money the most, right? You need money to get information, Freya. Also, I bought a storage unit and stored some wine. Roman replied logically. You bought a storage unit. Freya was stunned. When? when Freya wasn't paying attention. You have to tell me this kind of thing. Roman thought for a moment and shook his index finger mysteriously. A merchant's little secret. Secret my ass. Freya was speechless for a moment, but she also knew that Roman was like this. She couldn't continue the conversation for a while. Little Roman, you stored wine and not food? Brando asked. Yes, Brando. It's mainly gin and pine liqueur. Romain nodded. Brando carefully looked at the clean face in front of him. The Roman also looked at him with bright eyes. The girl's eyes always seemed to be filled with curiosity. You knew that the war would end in July. The young man couldn't help but ask. It was slightly later. The Roman also didn't expect the situation to take a turn for the worse. But Madara's army stopped in Dragos. I think they're looking for other prey. Didn't Brando always say that the best time to fight is on the first line? The undead commander should know this too. But no matter what, the nobles will need a celebration after the war. Isn't everyone talking about it? Romain replied while counting on her fingers. How do you know all this, Roman? Freya looked at her in disbelief. A merchant's little secret. Romain's tail was wagging to the sky again. You're a fast learner. Brando couldn't help but reach out and flick the little Roman's forehead. The little girl covered her forehead and frowned as she complained, Don't flick it, Brando. But Brando thought that it might have nothing to do with learning. It was just an instinctive reaction. In any case, it was rare to see a little Roman with this kind of talent. He then looked at the 3 bags of money on the table. There were less than 5,000 Tor coins in total. He realized that he would need a lot of money to maintain his current identity in Brugloss, as well as to realize his plans step by step. Not to mention the construction of his territory in the future. That would be even more expensive. As the saying goes, an emperor does not lack hungry soldiers. The Redo still had a bunch of people counting on him. Brando rubbed his forehead. He realized that he had missed a very important step in his schedule. It seemed that he had to prioritize making money first. However, he didn't expect to get the high-grade MP potion, the painting of Princess Dark Glory, and the endless ice earring. Those things were either too sensitive or hard to find in the south of Grimoires. Unless it was in the capital of Grimoires, Kirkle, the free port of Ampere Seal, White Sails, or the capital of the kingdom, Monsteros. Those places were filled with rich people. No matter what you sold in the black market, it wouldn't attract too much attention. Brando thought for a while. The only way he could make money now, other than being a charlatan, was probably through alchemy. Of course, the benefits of the former were uncertain, but the risk of being burned at the stake was certain. That was why alchemy was more reliable. Not to mention that he had Tamar as his assistant, which made it even easier. The nobles were all schemers. They would love to use the tree crystal, graveyard dust, Ebden spoils of war, and poison. The extra evening primrose, black sorcerer, and fluorescent moss could also be used to make MP potions, which would be highly sought after by the intermediate wizards. With that in mind, he asked, Roman, how much do you want? Is 100,000 Tor enough? 100,000. Freya was shocked. Brando, where do we have that much money? I heard that Count Nakin has a lot of money in his treasury. Brando rubbed his chin and replied. Why you? The ponytailed girl's face turned pale. Judging from Brando's behavior in Fortress Reden, she was afraid that he would really do that. However, Romain did not seem to be worried at all and replied heartlessly, a little more would be even better. Roman, you'll probably double the amount. Roman, don't cause trouble. Try to persuade Brando. He's planning to. Freya carefully looked around and did not say what she was planning to say. She was afraid that someone would hear and report it to the nobles nearby. If that happened, the three of them would not even be able to leave this inn. Freya, Brando can be trusted. Roman replied. Trust my ass. Freya was almost angered to death. But after thinking about it, she decided that she would not let Brando rob the noble's treasury. The last time he escaped from Fortress Reden was because he had no choice, but this time, he would not let it happen. It took her a lot of effort to convince herself that she was only doing this out of righteousness and not because she was worried that Brando would be executed. After thinking it through, she calmed down and sat down, glaring at Brando. Speaking of which, why did Brando bring everyone to this village so early in the morning? She suddenly realized another problem after calming down. The human village on the main road looked like a settlement with only 23 households and an inn. According to Brando, it was a nameless village that could not be seen on the map. But they had been here for half the morning. She could not help but look at Brando. What Freya did not expect was that Brendel was starting to get impatient from waiting for her. It had been almost half an hour since he sent Badam out, but he still had not returned. Could it be that he was wrong? But when he looked out of the inn's wooden window, it looked like this was the right place. Brando did not think that his memory had deteriorated to the point where he could not remember this place. He saw the old beech tree beside the carriage and the style of the buildings behind it. He was sure that he did not come to the wrong place. Could it be that it was too early and that person had not moved here yet? But didn't the forum say that he was already here when the game started? He could not help but frown. Then he finally saw a flash of red appear at the corner of the street. It was Badam's red beard. Brando raised his eyebrows. Today's fourth update has reached 15,000 words. The next chapter is going to be a 5,000-word chapter. Celebrating the first flight of the fourth generation has reached 20,000 words. As expected, I have not let down the country and the people. For the sake of Dangua, let's give him some support, brothers. Chapter 98. In the Amber Sword, there was a legend in the south of Grimoires that there was a level 120 scholar living in seclusion on the Needle Forest Avenue between Anquise and Brags. This legend had been circulating since the 380th year of the First Era, and it had always been a hot topic. But it wasn't until 4 years later that a player saw this legend for the first time. Brando knew that person. His name was Tolman. Tolman. Mithril. Oh certain, the master of the Mithril Castle, a great scholar, and an intermediate wizard. He was the silver leader of the 12 Circle Spell Society. Later, when the organization was disbanded during the Year of Seven Colors, he left Connect, a floating city in Buga, and returned to Grimoires to live in seclusion. In the game, when he was patient enough, he would help some players with the secondary profession of scholar. Of course, most of the time, he was disturbed by ordinary people and was not in a good mood. Therefore, after the initial popularity, most players returned to the noble library in Bragg's castle. After all, the secondary profession of scholar only required a little money to register. There was no need to look at the NPC's face, so there was no difference. However, players were strange creatures. They always tried to find some unknown secrets. Therefore, there had always been people trying to get some benefits from this old man, although Brando didn't know if these people had succeeded. But he had to admit that this time it was his turn. Anyway, there was no loss. Maybe he would succeed. Besides, Brando had always suspected that the secondary profession of Silver Castle Scholar in the game had something to do with this old man. He just never had the chance to test it out. Now that there was a ready-made opportunity, he certainly wouldn't give it up. However, he didn't expect that Tolman didn't live in this village. Instead, he lived on a hillside a few miles away. In the past, he only knew the rough address of Tolman in the game, and he didn't expect that this oversight would make him waste almost half the morning in this world. Doing things half-heartedly would hurt others and himself. The four of them strolled in the forest. The roads from Ankees to Bragg's castle were densely populated areas, so the forest didn't have the primitive scenery of Bucci. It was more like a rustic road through the forest. There were rows of wooden fences at intervals on both sides, and fallen leaves covered the gravel ground. Walking in such a place made people unconsciously relax. Freya stared at the beautiful scenery of the forest in a daze, and Roman followed behind her with his hands behind his back. He looked around as if he found it interesting. "Batum, are you sure the person we're looking for lives in this place?" Brendel asked impatiently after walking for almost an hour. "Batum, are you sure the person we're looking for lives in this place?" Batum wiped his red beard and took off his hat. "I'm absolutely certain, my lord. If you were looking for an old man with a long white beard and a habit of wearing a long gray robe that trailed to the ground, he was the only one in the neighborhood." "Don't worry, I'll ask Batum about it." Brando nodded. Batum was still trustworthy. Everything he did for the past month was appropriate. Of course, some of it was done in the way of mercenaries. In fact, Batum himself was used to Brando's orders. He was not as arrogant as many nobles. It was like he knew that Brando was a mercenary leader, so he ordered him around as if he was a mercenary leader. Batum was convinced and couldn't help but think that this was the standard of a leader. But the only doubt was the relationship between Brando and his wizard squire. The young man named the Shire would sometimes appear and sometimes disappear, making people feel mysterious. Sometimes Batum guessed what the master and servant were doing, but in the end, he could only blame it on the unfathomable Highland night. While the two were talking, the forest came to an end. Freya softly exclaimed in front, and then everyone's eyes suddenly opened up. In front of them was a meadow on the hillside, and a dirt road led to a small wooden house sitting alone at the top of the hill. It was a very strange house. When Brando and the others got closer, they found that it was like half a wooden barrel on the ground. The door was in the middle of the barrel, and there were arched windows on both sides. There were potted flowers on the windowsill, purple or silver. Even Brando couldn't name them. But they looked like hyacinths. At first, the young man thought so, but when he saw the evening primrose in the flower bed, he realized that these might be rare magic materials. Then they walked into the fence outside the wooden house. There was a bell hanging on the arched door, but Brando knew the rules. As long as Tolman wasn't taking a nap at this time, he would have discovered them through a warning spell. Therefore, if the guest rang the bell at this time, it would only make Tolman unhappy. Brando knew that the bell would only be rung when there was an emergency. He remembered that the only time it was rung in the game was when a dragon attacked a nearby village. It was at this moment that he felt Freya nudging his elbow. He turned around and saw Freya with a puzzled face. "Brando, what is this place?" She realized that Brando was here to meet someone, but who would live in this place? "It's just an old man's house." Brando looked away and stared at the door of the wooden house and answered casually. "Old man." "Yes, he's a wizard." Freya let out a low gasp, and the sword in her hand almost fell to the ground as she trembled. In fact, it wasn't just her. Even the knowledgeable Batum couldn't help but puff out his chest when he heard Brando's words. Sorcerers were sorcerers. Although Charles was also an apprentice sorcerer, compared to a real sorcerer, he was much worse. In fact, in Erewhon and even the entire countryside of Wonde, wizards had always been the most mysterious characters in pillow stories. Many people grew up listening to legends about wizards, and most of the descriptions about them were related to ghosts and gods. But in fact, Brando knew that wizards were very common in bustling areas, such as large cities or densely populated towns. In particular, the royal academies of many kingdoms also nurtured court magi. Thus, these people were not mysterious existences at all. Of course, if it was the dark wizards, witches, and necromancers, then they would be the same as the characters in the legends. Brando turned around and looked at the young Roman. He found that the merchant girl was also a little nervous. He couldn't help but ask, "What are you nervous about?" "My aunt said that we have to be polite when dealing with wizards. Otherwise, we will attract unnecessary trouble." The Roman answered matter-of-factly. Before Brando could reply, an old man's soft voice sounded from inside the house. Then, the wooden door creaked open. "This saying is not just some folklore. Little girl, who is your aunt?" The old voice seemed to be accompanied by the opening of the door and the old man behind the door. He was wearing a gray robe, a pair of tortoiseshell-rimmed glasses, a head full of silver hair, and a snow-white beard that extended all the way to his waist entered the senses of the four people present. It wasn't just the Roman and Freya. It was Brando's first time seeing Tolman, the legendary level 120 great scholar. "My aunt is my aunt." The Roman wasn't afraid of strangers at all. The old man glanced at the others, as if he was sizing them up. However, his somewhat muddy eyes swept past Brando and Badam one by one. He didn't stop, but his eyes fell on Freya. Finally, he glanced at the young Roman and smacked his lips. "Little girl, I know who your aunt is when I see you like this." "Humph, you've copied her temperament perfectly." As soon as he opened his mouth, Freya and Brando were surprised. Freya was surprised that the old man knew the Roman's aunt. Brando said that he was a wizard. Brando was also surprised that Tolman knew the Roman's aunt. However, the two of them were surprised on a completely different level. The difference between a wizard knowing someone and the master of the Mithril Castle, the silver leader of the 12th Circle Spell Society, was huge. "Have you seen the Roman's aunt, old man?" "You know Aunt Jenny?" The two spoke at the same time. Tolman was about to turn around and enter the house, but he stopped when he heard these words. At first, he looked at Freya and didn't answer. However, when his eyes fell on Brando, he replied, "Young man, don't you know what manners are?" Brando coughed. He was used to dealing with NPCs, and he was too shocked just now, so he made a slip of the tongue. At this time, he could only smile and play dumb. It's shameful to waste one's life. "Old man, I was just trying to save time." Tolman's squinted eyes widened slightly. "So you recognize me?" "Of course," Brando replied straightforwardly, "the master of the Mithril Castle, the silver leader of the 12th Circle Spell Society. How can I not know Lord Tolman?" Freya was still okay when he said that. The hat in Badam's hand unconsciously fell to the ground. He didn't know who the silver leader of the 12th Circle Spell Society was, but the master of the Mithril Castle was a famous wizard. There was a famous legend in the mercenary world. In the past, there was a group of scum in the mercenary world that was half mercenary and half thief. They set their sights on the legendary Mithril Hall. In the end, 400 to 500 people and 2 ogres went there, but in the end, they were all turned into stone. These stone statues still stood on the desolate beach of the Desolation Sea, for tourists to visit. Now, the legendary existence appeared in front of Badam. How could he not be shocked? But what shocked him even more was that Brando was still smiling and trying to establish a relationship with the other party. Could it be that his lord had lost his mind? But what made the red-bearded mercenary leader even more unbelievable was that, when Tolman heard Brando's words, he was stunned for a moment. Then, he stopped and looked at the young man again. He looked at Brando from top to bottom, as if to confirm whether there was such a person in his memory. Then, he opened his mouth and said, "Young man, it seems that you came prepared. But who are you? I don't remember anyone like you. Whose son are you?" Brando glanced at the Roman. He didn't expect Tolman to know the Roman's aunt. Then, the connection between them was a bit suspicious. It seemed that the identity of the little Roman's aunt was not that simple. At the very least, she had to be a famous witch. But there were only a few famous witches in history. Could it be that the legendary Pale Witch who abandoned her position as the Witch Queen and left the winter kingdom of Ibelia to come to the mortal world? For the time being, he buried this suspicion in the bottom of his heart. When he heard Tolman's question, he shook his head and said, "I'm not anyone's descendant, but I came here because I have a question." "A question?" Tolman was stunned. Brendel pointed to the shape of his mouth and pronounced, "Stam." The old man was stunned. At first, he seemed to have heard something. But then, he frowned and said, "What do you mean?" Brando was stunned. He was talking about the creation epic of the Cruz people, the original text in the Pale poem. In his time, each of these original texts was the cause of the Wizard War. The source of the fighting between the wizards. How could Tolman not have heard of it? He was stunned for a moment, and then he broke out in cold sweat. Could it be that there was no such thing as the Terra Slate in this world? But the young man immediately reacted. Maybe it was because it was too early, and the Terra Slate had not yet appeared. In the Amber Sword, the growth of Madara was just a branch in the history. Although it had a great impact on Erewhon and the surrounding countries, the real main story of that world was the appearance of the Terra Slate. The outbreak of the Wizard War. Of course, Brando did not want to bring the Terra Slate into this world so early, but he just wanted to use a single word in it to arouse Tolman's interest. Although this single word was almost meaningless to the full text, the magic contained in these words of creation should be basically the same. He believed that Tolman should be able to distinguish the mystery. He looked at Tolman and replied, "Old man, have you heard of the sacred poem that describes the creation of the world, the Pale poem of the Kurlutz people?" Tolman pressed a hand on his beard. He could indeed feel the primal and ancient magic power contained in that word. It was not powerful, but it seemed to be the root of all magic today. At first, he thought that it was an ancient dragon language, or a variant of the rune language, or the wizard language. But after he carefully searched his memory, he found that he could not find anything. Tolman did not doubt that the young man would lie to him. To be honest, as a scholar who had spent 100 years in the sea of books and practice, the ability to lie to him was at least admirable. "Are you talking about the first epic poem of the Cruz people who claimed to predate the Elven hymn?" the old man asked. Brando knew that the Silver Folk had a prejudice against humans. Although the wizards of Buga were human, they were not human. They were of noble blood and had always looked down on the people of the land. But the history of the Cruz people had a long history, which made the Silver Folk jealous and unwilling to admit it. As a player, he did not mind this and just nodded. "What does that have to do with the word you just said?" Tolman stopped and asked. In fact, at this time, the discussion between the two of them had gone beyond the limits of what Freya, Badam, and Roman could accept. The three of them were already confused. As for Freya, she just enlarged Brando's shadow in her heart again, and Badam was already shocked to the extreme. But God knew that Brando himself was just fooling them. That is the original text of the Pale poem, describing how our world was created by the kindness of Martha. "Lord Tolman, I am not lying. You should be able to feel the magic contained in that word for yourself." Brando replied. Tolman's face changed, and he had already turned back to the house. Soon, there was the sound of books being flipped in the wooden house. At this moment, Brando knew that his plan was half successful. He turned back and gestured to Freya and the others, asking them to follow. Then he led the three of them into Tolman's house. "My stomach hurts a little at night. Let's write 4,500 first. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidien.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 99. When Brando stepped into Tolman's room, the first thing he saw were the scattered manuscripts on the shiny black pine floor. He turned his head to the left, and saw a large thick book on a wooden table. The invention of the paper page in this world was not very clever, and in order to write on the coarse pages, it was often necessary to make a large piece of paper, and then to fix it with a wooden frame covered with cowhide. Therefore, it took a lot of time and effort to move the books, and they were easily damaged. Although the kingdom had aristocratic libraries and royal academies, they were only for the descendants of merchants, small nobles, and landowners to enjoy an education. Even in rich countries, ordinary citizens with a good living were more willing to send their children to various workshops to be apprentices. Brando quickly saw the contents of the book. What a coincidence, Tolman was actually researching an ancient language. He couldn't help but look at the manuscripts on the floor. Tolman was probably researching the changes in the Highland languages, Cruise languages. From the records in the manuscripts, he seemed to have some results. In this era, ordinary people would not be able to understand these manuscripts. Knowledgeable people like Badam would see these manuscripts as waste paper, and Freya would at most think that they were scribbles. The sound of flipping through the pages finally stopped. "Young man, where did you find this language?" After Tolman searched through a series of related documents, he finally found a language that was very similar to the word Brendel spoke in terms of pronunciation and structure. The ancient Karanji language. The Karanji people were the weakest of the 5 ancient Cruise tribes, but this was enough to prove that Brando's words were true. Did the ancestors of the Cruise people really record history? Although Tolman had always suspected that the modern Cruise people were not the descendants of the ancient Cruise people, he could not explain why the Flame King Gretel had the distinct characteristics of the ancient Cruise people. Brando smiled but did not answer. Tolman put on his spectacles and walked out of the room with a thick book in his arms. He sat on a rattan chair opposite Brando and looked up at the 4 of them. Then, he opened a bookcase and took out a pipe from the second drawer. He knocked it on the table, and a ball of flame and smoke rose from the pipe. Tolman put the pipe in his mouth and took a puff, blowing out smoke from his nose. Then, he opened his mouth and said, "Since you're not talking, it seems that you have a request." "Young man, tell me your request." "I have to say, you've already half succeeded. You've successfully piqued this old man's curiosity." He took out the pipe and pointed it at Brando, "But you haven't won yet, young man." Tolman may be old, but I'm old. But I'm not senile. What do you want from me with a single word? You'd better give me something useful. Badam and Freya were stunned by the old man's words. They realized that Brando was making a deal with the old man. However, the deal between wizards made them a little confused. They still did not know what the old man and the young man wanted to do. Romaine, on the other hand, was rather interested. She liked Brendel's calmness. She had an instinctive feeling that even though the strange old man was stubborn, he had already given in to Brendel's demands. "I'm a Highland knight. I need someone to introduce me into the circle of scholars. My guide told me to come here and tell me what to do." "That's how it is, Master Tolman." Brendel decided to continue with this farce. After all, he was not lying in a certain sense. The guide was the mentor of a Highland knight. According to the Highland law, he had the responsibility to guide the growth of a knight. Brando's words would not arouse suspicion, and it would also make Tolman suspicious. He knew that Tolman knew a lot of wizards from the Black Tower. Tolman put one hand on the armrest of the rattan chair. He took a puff of his cigarette and fell into deep thought. He was thinking about which old man had tricked him. Although he was not a powerful wizard, he was a senior scholar and a great alchemist. He was very famous in the wizarding world. His friends and enemies were all overwhelmed, so it was hard for him to think of who was playing this trick on him. However, he thought about it. Introducing a newcomer into the circle of scholars was not a big deal. Looking at Brando's performance, it would not be too embarrassing. Tolman took a puff of his cigarette and suddenly took out a piece of parchment from the drawer. He took a quill and wrote something on it. Then he folded the parchment and put it in an envelope. He dripped some wax and stamped it. He picked up the envelope and looked up. I recommend you to learn from Panison for a while. You will know how we do things. Sir Panison is a very rigid person, but he is a very good teacher. What do you think? Perfect, Brando replied. However, he thought that this was just a normal procedure. Could it be that he was working so hard just to save a few hundred tor for the registration fee? Of course not. He resolved to make a further effort, and, therefore, approaching the letter, he answered, as he took it between his middle and forefinger, Lord Tolman, as regards the former word, he said. I have to say that I am researching an ancient language of the Cruise people. I have made a small discovery. Some of the natives living in the Balta Highlands seem to have maintained their primitive customs. The wizards among them have a few words that have been passed down from the ancient times, but they still maintain the most primitive aspect of the Cruise language. Brando replied half-truthfully. The natives of the Balta Highlands were real, and the series of discoveries did start from that desolate place. However, the first stone slab was found in another place. To be honest, the stone slab had no practical use for Brando, so he did not want the world to enter an era of chaos. Tolman's eyes lit up, and the smoke from the pipe in his mouth flickered. You are researching the ancient language of the Cruise people? He looked at the young man suspiciously. Tell me, what else do you have in mind? Lord Tolman, you must have discovered that the ancient language is full of magic. That is why there is a saying that words and language are the root of all magic. But the era of chaos is a watershed. Ever since the ancient Cruise people, the magic of words has gradually declined. Brando thought for a while and picked out a background that he had seen on the forum. The foresight of the era allowed him to know more about the core background than the scholar. Tolman nodded and showed a look of agreement. The cause and effect should be related to the Long War. He replied. Long War, interesting. The old man turned around and took out a ring from the drawer and put it on the envelope. Perhaps you can go to Sir Panison's private library to take a look. If you have any new ideas, you can bring this ring back to me. There is a way. Brando's heart brightened. He did not know if anyone had done this before, but he knew that every step after this would not be simple. But at least it was a good start. He was secretly happy. However, Tolman did not completely trust him. His method of stalling was unique. Brando knew that the old man would probably leave for the Balta Highlands immediately, but it was hard to say if he would gain anything. Thinking of this, he took the envelope and the ring. A line of ghostly green words appeared on his retina. They seemed to appear one by one in his vision, forming a question: do you accept the profession, subclass scholar? Brando, of course, chose to accept. As a result, a new sub-column appeared on his status panel: secondary profession. The scholar profession was quietly lying in that column, and its EXP was at level 0/6. Currently, there was only a small row of words below this profession: historical knowledge level 1. In the Amber Sword, subclasses were a supplement to the official profession. They were different from the main profession. Subclasses generally strengthened a character from the side, so they did not provide powerful skills or attribute bonuses, but they could give the character some special abilities. It could be said that subclasses were more similar to identities, but they could be upgraded. For example, whenever the character practiced a knowledge to level 5 or higher, he would be able to unlock a corresponding, familiar profession. When he took this profession, the EXP penalty would not be included in the total number of subclasses. This would continue until he had 3 familiar professions. At the same time, the scholar provided 3 times more EXP per level than the militia, so it was called a necessary subclass by the players in the game. The Silverfort scholar was even stronger. The Silverfort scholar had 4 familiar professions and regarded alchemy as his main profession. It was equivalent to the combination of the scholar subclass and the alchemist subclass. Of course, the EXP penalty was also shared between subclasses, but it did not affect the main profession. As soon as Brando took the profession, he immediately put in 220 EXP to raise the scholar to level 6, gaining 250 EXP. The scholar subclass had a 1:1 ratio of EXP to EXP for the first 6 levels, which was the most terrifying of all professions. However, there was a problem with subclasses, which was that the profession level could not exceed the skill level by more than 5 levels. Brando needed knowledge of nobility or heraldry, not history, so he had to put the scholar level aside for now. After finishing his own business, it was as if he was distracted for a moment. He looked up and asked, "Lord Tolman, I have a friend, as you have seen. You know her aunt, but she was separated from her aunt. We are looking for her. Have you seen the Roman aunt?" Tolman tapped his pipe on the table, raised his glasses, and replied, "Young man, I only know her aunt. We haven't seen each other for more than 10 years. When I saw her, she was the same age as this little girl. In fact, I didn't know she lived around here." He saw that Brando was about to say something, so he quickly waved his hand. "You don't need to ask anymore. Every wizard has their own secrets. Since she didn't tell you, I won't say anything else." The old man blew out smoke from his nose. "All right, our conversation is almost over. Young man, you have achieved your goal. When you think you have a certain understanding of your current path, it won't be too late to find me." Brando was stunned and turned to look at the Roman. Romain smiled sweetly at him. "It's okay, Brando. My aunt is the best." "You bastard." Brando glared at her, but his heart softened. P.S. Circuit modification, disconnection in progress. Don't know how many days it will take. Sad. Don't feel good writing in an internet cafe. To be continued. If you want to know the future, please go to www.chidien.com. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 100. After the three of them left Tolman's house near the Needle Forest Avenue, Badam could not help but ask Brando cautiously, "My lord, your elder must be familiar with that wizard, right?" The young man glanced at the red-bearded mercenary leader, smiled and did not answer. Badam was stunned for a while and could not figure out what was going on. Even though the young knight had led them to clear a path out of the undead army and left a deep impression on him, he could not help but suspect that Brendel's actions and words were not like the actions of a great noble. The young man had said that he would inherit a territory, but Badam could not help but doubt it. Of course, he did not feel alienated because of this distrust. He still wholeheartedly worked for Brando. After all, he still felt that following this outstanding young man might be more promising. It was just that he could not help but secretly feel that nobles still cared about their reputation. But everything that happened before this had subverted the mercenary leader's understanding. Unlike Freya, who at most magnified Brando's mysterious halo in her heart, Badam firmly believed in Brando's words. This young knight not only had a strong background, but it might not even be an ordinary one. Most people would not want to get involved with the powerful Highland Adept lords. Those nobles who had formed their own faction would not even lower their heads in front of the king. Thinking of this, Badam could not help but look at Brando in front of him and scratched his head. The third morning. The group finally arrived at the legendary Brags. Brags could be said to be the center of the southern part of Grenoires. This city was built on the side of the mountain east of the Pine River, on the gentle slope of the gray-faced Vulture Hills, distributed along the gentle slope downwards. It had a concentric circle of grayish-white walls that grew taller and taller. Looking at it from the Needle Forest Avenue, it looked like it was molded out of plaster. That was why the locals called Brugloss the White City. On a clear day, travelers from Anzac and Dragos could see the gleaming brown roofs of the city from a dozen miles away, and the streets that ran up the hillsides one level after another. In the medieval era, this was undoubtedly a very magnificent scene, symbolizing the prosperity of civilization. Of course, Bragg's was not a real big city, but at least in the large area east of the Pine River, it was densely packed with 35,000 people. Even in the southern part of Grenoires, this was probably the most densely populated area. Bragg's also had the facilities that most cities had. For example, the Black Pine Avenue was lined with shops and workshops, and rows of wooden houses of different heights formed the unique scenery of this area. Travelers and merchants from the surrounding areas gathered here, and the streets were always filled with carriages, mules, and horses. It was the first time that Freya and Roman came to such a big city. Although the two rural girls had always thought that Fortress Rieden and Anzac were the limit of their imagination, Bragg's towering walls, clean streets, and bustling businesses still left them deeply in awe. Before the Year of the Dagger, Bragg's existed as a military fortress that monitored Madara from the south. Therefore, it had a natural sense of majesty. Even a modern person like Brando could not help but be amazed when he saw it, let alone Roman and Freya who had not seen the world. The novelty would definitely arouse their interest. Everyone was in high spirits, but Romain and Freya soon stopped in front of a silversmith's shop. Girls always liked this kind of shiny and exquisite trinkets. Besides, Bragg's silver was famous throughout the kingdom, and its silversmiths also had first-class craftsmanship. Freya looked enviously at a crescent-shaped brooch, and Roman fell in love with a small silver box. But what made Brando laugh was that the two of them covered their bags tightly. It was a common habit of rural girls. The young man quietly pulled Badam to the side and asked the silversmith for the price. The last few hundred tour they had were spent like water. But Roman was pleasantly surprised by the two small gifts and accepted them without any qualms. She even glanced at him happily. The future goddess of war, Freya, blushed and lowered her head. She thought for a while and reluctantly accepted the gifts. Then, she whispered a thank you to the young man. Brando was not surprised by Freya's bashfulness. But when he turned around, he saw Badam secretly giving him a thumbs up. Brando was stunned for a moment and could not help but laugh. Redbeard had a lot of ideas. He just did not want the two girls to be disappointed. After a short interlude, the group crossed the entire street and found their destination at the end of Black Pine Avenue. The headquarters of the Silver-Winged Cavalry. In fact, before the few of them could enter, they saw the sneaky little phoenix outside. It seemed that the little guy had been doing well recently. He had even put on some weight. Petit Finus could not believe his eyes when he saw the three of them. He could not help but rub his eyes. Big sister. Brando. Roman. The young man exclaimed in surprise and jumped down from a rock at the entrance of the cavalry headquarters. He looked at them as if he was hallucinating. God, am I dreaming? Freya subconsciously wanted to reprimand him when she saw how rash he was. But when she was about to say it, she changed it to, Petit Finus, where is everyone? Everyone is here. We are fine, big sister. He then looked at Brando and said with a look of admiration, Big brother Brando, everyone already knows what happened in Fortress Rieden. After the refugees you rescued went to Dragos, some of them came to Bragg's and your deeds spread. Big brother Brando, did you really fight side by side with the super-powerful mercenary Red Copper Dragon Reto? Red Copper Dragon Reto. Brando was stunned. Although he had expected this, he did not expect these people to give Reto such a title. Little brat, what do you know about being powerful? Badam heard Petit Finus' words. Although he knew that this version of the rumor was spread by Brando, he did not know why this young man did not want to be in the limelight, but he could not help but interrupt. Of course I know. A person who led a few hundred people to kill tens of thousands of undead. Isn't that powerful? Petit Finus answered logically, Red Copper Dragon, Reto, I heard that he was a veteran of the November War. Just like Captain Martin, of course he is powerful. Oh right, who are you, uncle? Badam almost choked to death, but when he was about to answer, Petit Finus' eyes suddenly lit up and shouted, "Don't tell me you are Redbeard Badam." "Hey, little brat, you know me." Badam was stunned. "Of course I know you. Now, there are not many people in Braggs who do not know you. Everyone in the streets and alleys is talking about the Redbeard Badam who makes the undead tremble. If you don't believe me, you can ask the cavalry inside. Even they know." Petit Finus said with bright eyes. Making the undead tremble, this title is not bad. Everyone liked to hear compliments, and Badam was no exception. However, just as he smiled proudly, he suddenly remembered that the young man who had created all these miracles was still on the side. He quickly restrained his smile and reprimanded, "Humph, a group of idiots." Petit Finus was stunned and was confused by the reprimand. However, he was young and took it for granted that most of the experts with extraordinary skills had strange temperaments, so he did not take it seriously. Instead, he looked at Brando and said, "Big brother Brando, you are so powerful, you must be an important member of those mercenaries, right?" Brando smiled and rubbed the little brat's head as he nodded. "Che, I told you, those brats on the street didn't believe me." Freya felt awkward listening to the side. She looked at Brando and thought that he was a liar. However, when she thought of Brando's indomitable spirit in the midst of an army of 10,000, her heart could not help but beat faster. She could only turn her head to the side. On the other hand, the Roman was smiling at the side, but no one knew what he was thinking. While they were talking, the news of the return of the hero of Fortress Reden had already spread around the cavalry headquarters. The citizens of the town loved to watch a show, and in a short while, the streets were filled with people. Even some of the younger members of the silver-winged cavalry couldn't help but run out in twos and threes. They wanted to see what kind of person the undead was. After all, these people were part of the White Mane Army. Some of them had even fought with Madara's troops before, so they knew how difficult it was to deal with the undead. In fact, the silver-winged cavalry did not want to believe these ridiculous rumors. However, as the rumors spread day by day, and many of their comrades from Fortress Reden were among the refugees, the commander of the silver-winged cavalry, Sir Sconard, realized that they might be facing the truth. After all, there were still a few thousand refugees gathered around Braggs. Although no one had seen the legendary copper dragon Reto, no one had seen what it looked like. This was a huge contribution. Thus, the higher-ups and the lower-ranking officers had different opinions. The higher-ups wanted to get in touch with the undead to find out what was going on, while the lower-ranking officers wanted to compare themselves with the undead. "Finus, are they the mercenaries from Fortress Reden?" Brando quickly saw a few youths coming out from the crowd and asked Petit Finus. "Of course, this is my big sister. This is my big brother Brando, and this is..." Petit Finus pointed at Badam and kept them in suspense. "He can't be Redbeard Badam, right?" The youths' faces changed. After all, Badam's red beard was too recognizable. "Hee, you guys are smart." Petit Finus was so excited that his tail was about to reach the sky. He knew that Brando was powerful, but he didn't expect him to be related to those legendary people. Although he had been bragging a few days ago, no one believed him. Today, when he saw these people's shocked expressions, it was worth it. But while he was bragging, he felt a few of the silver-winged cavalry's gazes drifting over to him with ill intentions. He didn't find it strange. The reason why he gave the order was because he didn't want to be in the limelight. After all, he was still weak and couldn't stand in the limelight. That was why he wanted to find someone to be his shield. Originally, Badam was the best choice, but he needed someone who was familiar with the place, so he settled for Reto. But he did not expect that even so, the military was still dissatisfied. He sighed, and at the same time, he could only be on his guard. Not only in real life, but he had also seen a lot of trouble caused by jealousy over a title in the game. P.S. The conditions are tough, use your votes to help. To be continued. If you want to know more, please go to www.cheatyin.com. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 101. Of course, the gazes of the cavalrymen only caught his attention, and he believed that the white main army would not be so ignorant. Just like before, Brando had no intention of entering Erwin's corrupt system, but he had already predicted that the refugees would be exposed. Because of this, experienced mercenaries who pursued freedom and money became the best candidates to replace him in the limelight. The halo that shrouded over a group of people was always dimmer than the halo that shrouded over a single person. When people thought of the fact that it was a group of experienced mercenaries who led the refugees to carve out a path of blood, they would feel that it was only natural. This was only true for normal people. The fall of Fortress Reden was like a ticking time bomb. No matter what, the White Main Army's night group would not be able to escape the blame after the war. Thus, if they were to show off, it would only serve to highlight their incompetence. If he was the only one in the spotlight, his vanity would be satisfied, but the nobles would be the ones laughing the loudest. I don't want to be branded as a member of any faction. Thus, after his arrangements, the situation changed. Because the more people involved in the story, the easier it would be to change the way the story was written. Brando knew that the shrewd nobles would definitely understand this point. The next step would be to see if the cunning old man did a clean job. At the very least, they would find a scapegoat to take all the blame and whitewash the story. That would be the key to saving their face. But this had nothing to do with him. He did not want to deal with these people, but he did not have a choice. But at least there was another benefit, and that was that the name, the Amber Sword, would spread. Other than the few youths beside Petit Finus, the citizens outside the silver-winged cavalry headquarters quickly dispersed. Brando also quickly met up with old Martin. The old guard captain seemed to be in a hurry for the past few days, to the point that there were a few more wrinkles on his face. Brando could guess what he was worried about. It was probably because he did not understand the situation between the nobles. Within Brugloss, the conflict between Count Nakin's local nobles and the military nobles had reached its climax. Under such circumstances, only a carefree youth like Petit Finus would focus on the rumors in the city. Thinking until here, he walked over to greet him. Martin remembered this young man who was not afraid of death. This veteran who had experienced the November War raised his eyebrows when he saw him. Although the old man heard that Brando and Freya were fine, he could not help but let out a sigh of relief and was secretly glad that Martha was protecting him. Then, his gaze landed on Freya. The girl with a long ponytail immediately, she bowed and replied, "Captain Martin, I've returned." Martin nodded and showed a relieved smile. Good, good. It's good that you're back. But before he could finish his sentence, he couldn't help but recall that the villagers of Butchie were still destitute while the nobles were fighting for power. Although he wasn't from Butchie, he was speechless for a moment. Seeing that Martin seemed to have aged 10 years, Freya also remembered Aunt Syl's family who died at the hands of Madara. Her eyes could not help but redden. Brando saw the little Roman constantly looking at him and could not help but sigh. Although this girl was careless, sometimes she was sharp and astute. But when you pay attention to this merchant lady, she would start to act obedient and throw a tantrum. When he thought of this, he patted Freya's back and comforted the girl with a long ponytail. Then, he said to Martin, "Captain Martin, I have to say something presumptuous. But you don't have to think too much about the matters between nobles. After all, we are just small characters who need to obediently wait for their final decision." Martin was stunned. He did not expect Brando to see through his troubles. Although he was a veteran of the November War, he was not good at scheming. These few days, he had exhausted his mind and soul and was almost unable to bear it. Sometimes, he really envied Petit Finus the brat who did not have to worry about anything. But for Martin, as someone who came later in history, Brando's view was simpler than his. Because in this situation, Martin and his group's decision would not have any effect. Thus, they might as well not make a decision and wait for others to arrange everything for them. Although this sounded a little helpless, it was the truth. That was what he wanted to tell Martin. But after Brando explained it to the veteran, the old guard captain could not help but be shocked. He looked at Brando suspiciously and asked, "Young man, who are you? Ordinary people can't see these things so clearly. Let alone ordinary people, even I can't see them clearly." His words confirmed Freya's guess. Since Captain Martin said so, then Brando's identity was certain. Freya thought to herself. She then went up and told the veteran of the November War about Brando's identity. Of course, it was about the Highland Knight. Martin was enlightened. "So you are a noble and a Highland Knight." After hearing this, the old guard captain could not help but look at Brando with surprise. He said, "Speaking of which, when I was young, I had the opportunity to fight side by side with a Highland Knight. Although most people say that the Highland Knight is unruly, I have to say that they are all heroes." He looked at Brando again. "It seems that their descendants are also impatient. Brando, at least you have proved this point." "You flatter me, Captain Martin." "No, when you said that you wanted to deliver the letter from Mount Seville, I simply thought that you were a young man who was not afraid of death. And if it wasn't for the Roman girl who insisted on going with you, I wouldn't have supported you." Martin replied, "Of course, as for later, I sent Freya to chase after you, that's another matter. But in any case, your subsequent performance can be considered as heroic. Young man, true courage is not recklessness, but knowing what you are doing. Your actions are clearly worthy of this." The old guard captain patted Brando and Freya's shoulders with both hands. "Both of you are good. Erwin is a role model for young people." Freya was silent. She looked at Brando. She thought that most of the credit actually belonged to Brando. It was just that no one knew about it. Of course, Brando would not be so foolish as to say it out loud. Afterwards, they met with the rest of the Butchie militia. Ike, Irene, and Mackie, who had a good relationship with him, naturally came to congratulate him. Mackie even brought a small barrel of ale, saying that he wanted to toast to the survival of the calamity. The taciturn Niberto and Vlad only patted each other's shoulders. They were not good with words, but their feelings were naturally included in their actions. The only unexpected thing was that they bumped into Breton along the way. This young man was with his father, and he did not confront Brendel directly. He only nodded slightly at Brendel, and the two parties brushed past each other. Mackie then told him that Breton had been depressed for the past month, and only recently did he feel slightly better. Brando could not help but be silent for a moment after hearing this news. A person who could blame himself for the death of a comrade was not too bad. This confirmed one of his thoughts. When the celebration came to an end, a few young silver-winged cavalry joined in. When Brando saw these young men, he could not help but look at Badham. This meant that his plan to disperse the hatred was quite successful. After all, jealousy was something that humans were born with, and it was unavoidable. However, as long as he kept a low profile, he would still be able to win friends. After the celebration, the old guard Captain Martin came to ask him about the nobles again. This time, Brando purposely asked Freya to stay behind and replied, "Uncle Martin, the truth is that the situation is already clear. The White Mane Army's Knights forces will soon come to contact us. This means that they have already made a decision. But don't worry, this decision has nothing to do with us. We just have to accept the rewards with a clear conscience." "What do you mean?" Martin asked. "The general situation is like this. They need people to become heroes. People like you and Freya who have performed outstandingly, and also came from the guards or the militia. Only then can people think of the local army. Brando replied, and Uncle Martin, you led the butchy villagers out of the encirclement and sent a message to Fort Vermeer. This matter is easy to explain, because as long as Uncle Martin came from the guards, your contribution would be their contribution. But a group of mercenaries led 1,000 to 2,000 refugees from Fort Redon and killed a bloody path out of tens of thousands of undead. It's a little hard to explain, if not, the White Mane Army would become a laughingstock. But on the one hand, these two deeds have already spread to Brags, Anzek and even Dragos, and they have no choice but to admit it. Thus, how to deal with this matter is a very ingenious matter. So that's how it is, we are actually just a cover. Badam suddenly understood. Brando nodded, so the key lies with Freya. Me? Freya was originally lost in her thoughts, but she suddenly woke up. Brando, Martin went silent. Brando's words were very straightforward, but the old man found it hard to accept. Although he knew some of the matters between the nobles, he did not expect a war to be so simple in their eyes. In that case, what was the point of all these people fighting here? Freya, don't answer first, let me finish. Brando looked at the ponytailed girl and said. Freya was stunned, but she nodded. Brando continued, but the Knights group has their own reservations. They don't want to interact with mercenaries because to them, mercenaries are greedy and fight for money. They are not real soldiers. Interacting with these people is a very undignified way of doing things. Badam spat in disdain. Brando looked at him and smiled. Of course, if there is no other choice, they will still send people to contact them in private, hypocrites. Badam rubbed his red beard and replied. You can say that, they are always hypocrites. Or perhaps it's because of his vanity. Brendel replied faintly. Isn't it too short-sighted for the nobles to think this way? Martin still found it hard to believe. After all, he was deeply influenced by the army. He could not believe that the high and mighty nobles would be so shallow and hypocritical. Short-sighted. Brando shook his head. In fact, he knew these nobles better than the soldiers themselves. These nobles were not short-sighted, nor were they stupid. They were even too smart, but of course, they were also selfish and greedy examples. As long as they had power and an army, the nobles could be independent. They did not need to share the burden of the royal family and the lower-class citizens. Even if their territory was invaded, it did not matter as Madara would retreat. Even if their predictions were wrong, with their wealth, they could live a respectable life in any country in the world. In the end, the ones who would suffer were the lower-class citizens. Since that was the case, the nobles would naturally indulge in the struggle for power. Why not? Brando looked at the people present and continued, this way, among us, Freya would be the most ideal candidate for the White Mane Knights group. At least, with her background as a militia, the commoners would associate her with the military. But, isn't Gasol good enough too? He is the captain of Fortress Redon's cavalry, isn't he more suitable than me? Freya resisted the urge to tell them about the dragon-subduing tower because Brando strictly forbade them from revealing the identity of the dragon-subduing tower. This would bring them trouble. Brando shook his head, it's the opposite. At least in Fortress Redon, the cavalry belongs to the nobles. They are just private soldiers. The reason why they were created was to restrict the White Mane Army's swordsmen. Do you think the White Mane Army would be so noble as to create prestige for their enemies? After Brando said that, the people present immediately realized that Freya was indeed the only possible candidate. Even Freya herself was startled for a moment, and kept quiet. P.S. This is the first chapter. When one is unlucky, even drinking cold water would cause one to choke. I even endured the disconnection, but I went to the internet cafe yesterday and left my keys at home. I was forced to stay in the internet cafe for the whole night. It's so cold to sleep in the internet cafe. To be continued. If you want to know the future, please go to www.chidien.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 102. Brando looked at Freya and remained silent. He knew that she might not be able to figure out what was going on. This was normal since this country girl had never come into contact with the complicated and decadent business of the nobles. But to put it bluntly, it was actually very simple. It was nothing more than benefits. Thus, he decided to open the topic and said frankly, I know that it is hard for you to accept this. But this is the truth, and it is not enough for us to just do this. Because to put it bluntly, we are now just a chess piece in the hands of the nobles. They only care about whether or not this chess piece will be useful, and they do not care about the life or death of the chess piece. Freya was shocked and raised her head to look at him. Martin frowned and sighed. Brando's words confirmed what he had seen in the past few days. The nobles said that they would immediately reward them, and everyone was enthusiastic. But to put it bluntly, it was still to achieve the other party's goal. What would they get in the end? It could be a promotion for one or two people, a little reward, or even just glory. But he had mentioned the matter of the homeless villagers in Butchie several times, but it was always like a stone thrown into the sea. Freya, Brando turned his head and looked at Freya's light brown eyes, and said, You want to protect the villagers in Butchie. If you only have the naive and unrealistic idea that everyone will be rewarded after the war, and then return to their hometown happily and peacefully, I'm afraid you will be disappointed. Brando. If you only have the idea of relying on others, you will become an abandoned pawn of the nobles. He interrupted her and continued. If Brando had said this earlier, Freya would not have believed him. But after seeing so much along the way, she more or less understood this point. Thus, the girl with a long ponytail hesitated and asked, But what should I do, Brando? Of course, you have to grow up and become someone who can protect others. Brando answered. I understand, but Freya couldn't help but answer anxiously. She thought to herself that she was just a small militia captain. How could she grow to the same level as those high and mighty nobles? The country girl thought about it again and again, but she still felt that it was impossible. You're worried you won't be able to? He asked. Freya nodded. Don't worry, the opportunity will come soon. Trust me, do you still remember what I said? Brando smiled and replied. Freya was slightly stunned. Brando, on the other hand, understood that he did not reveal his true intentions. In fact, he hoped that this ponytailed girl could enter the Royal Cavalry Academy and receive higher education, learning the most orthodox commanding and tactical knowledge of the kingdom. On one hand, he didn't want to change the path that the future Valkyrie had taken. On the other hand, he needed someone to enter the upper echelons of the kingdom. From the looks of it, the Roman didn't have such thoughts at all. The only person who had such thoughts and was trustworthy was probably Freya. In terms of safety, there was naturally no need to consider. The Royal Cavalry Academy was located in Vilan, south of Erech. It was one of the private territories of the royal family. During the December Civil War, it was one of the earliest territories under the control of the princess, so there wouldn't be any problems. And this matter in itself was beneficial to Freya. In fact, Aween's classical military command and tactics were not backward at all. Aween's history of war had left many outstanding military commanders and tactical ideas behind. It was just that its internal organization was too corrupted, causing these legacies to be unable to be used. Just like during the Renaissance period, Erewhon also had a group of outstanding young military officers. Brando believed that with Freya's seriousness, she would be able to absorb knowledge like a sponge in this atmosphere. When she had accumulated enough knowledge, she would quickly stand out and attract the attention of the princess, just like in history. Brando remembered that in history, in June of the second year, during the 64th spear competition of the Royal Cavalry Academy, Freya met the eldest princess of Erewhon. Perhaps there would be some changes in history, but he hadn't had the time to flap his wings, so he didn't think the changes would be too big. In particular, he urgently wanted to use Freya to understand the future princess regent, Griffine Corvinov, who was only 16 years old this year. Griffine Corvinov. What was Menofie thinking? Brando didn't think that there was any conflict of interest between him and the princess. She wanted to revive the kingdom, and Brando wanted to change the fate of Erewhon. However, to what extent could the genius of the Corvinov family achieve? Brando was worried that the half-elf girl from the royal family wouldn't be able to let go of the interests of the nobles. Brando, on the other hand, was different. He still held on to the dream left behind from the game. He couldn't forget the comrades who fought side by side with him in the past, and the scenes that happened in history. Could he watch as Erewhon fell into the flames of war? He remembered the day the royal capital of Monsteros was captured. The palaces and cities were set ablaze in flames, and the sky was filled with dark clouds. That day, he and many other players were ordered to retreat from the north. When they looked back at their homeland in the south, many of them cried. Time was too short, and they couldn't change it. Could he watch as Freya fought to the death in the Crimson Canyon of Derer? He remembered that day when all of them were fighting with their lives on the line. He alone had lost more than 7 levels, and there were countless other players who had suffered the same fate as him. But what was the result? Brando looked at Freya, who didn't look at him. The Valkyrie, who looked like a girl next door, was wearing a silver sunflower armor and holding a square flag embroidered with a black pine leaf emblem, which was called the symbol of Erewhon's courage. But in the end, they couldn't protect the main flag, and the Valkyrie in the silver armor sacrificed herself in the war. Perhaps she at least fulfilled her promise. She shed her last drop of blood for the sake of this land. It was a pity that Owain was too weak and too old. The 3 legions did not advance, and Kurlut's reinforcements did nothing. On the day of the final battle, other than Freya's own legions, other than the players, there were only the players. 36,000 players who swore to die were just a stone in the way in front of Madara's army. Princess Griffine, known as the Pearl of Corvado and the Bright Star of Erewhon, married Duke Arek, whom she didn't like, for the sake of the kingdom. She was depressed all her life, and in the end, she couldn't escape the conspiracy of all for one and died in a murder. In that world, Erewhon was left with only players like them. His former leader, his seniors and seniors. They left the Amber Sword for many years, but every time they talked about the battle in the past at a gathering, everyone couldn't help but be silent and teary. Erewhon's spirit no longer existed. Brando looked at Freya, and then looked at the Roman and the old Martin. Could he tolerate this happening again? He shook his head. Perhaps if he didn't know what was going to happen, he could have chosen to escape alone. With what he knew of this world, he might have created a legend. Unfortunately, God sent him to Erewhon at the moment of the First War of the Black Rose, and let him know the Roman, Freya, and everyone else in this history. Brando might have understood what kind of mission he had shouldered. If he wanted to change history, he couldn't take into account the interests of some people, and he would wipe out everyone in front of him one by one. But he also understood that there was a voice in his heart telling him, Brando, if you take this path, you may have to face the local nobles who are deeply rooted in Erewhon, and even the 5 historically powerful Grand Dukes. Even the proud Princess Regent had to compromise in front of them. You even have to face Madara, which is growing stronger day by day and embarking on the most glorious period in history. Its talented generals are endless. Black Lord Insursta, One-Eyed General Tarkus, Immortal Wayland, Pride of the Black Rose, Ogiest, Imperial Sword Greta, and His Majesty the Emperor with the Mercury Staff. Any one of them is a genius. How can a mere Valkyrie of civilian background stand in the way of history? Even if you join in, what can you do? And in the north, the people of Cruz were also watching everything indifferently. Brando, today's Eagle Empire is no longer the ancient and benevolent cradle of human civilization. The pride of the Highlanders, the 11th son of Grand Tokri the Great, is presiding over a reform of iron and blood. The war machine is playing powerfully, and with the appearance of the Earth Slate as an opportunity, the Third Holy War will soon begin. When that time comes, Madara, Cruz, and even the northern countries of Buga will just be chess pieces on a huge chessboard, fighting for survival. Do you really have the confidence to face all of this? Brando, if you make this choice, Erwin will have to face the entire world. Because you have chosen to stand on the opposite side of history. But Brando shook his head and threw this cold thought out of his mind. He had thought about all of this when he led the refugees to fight their way out of Fortress Reden. Even if he was facing a whole world, Brando's pride came from the fact that he was once a player in this world. This identity was like the combination of countless figures in another world, and it symbolized a group of people challenging the original rules of this world. Perhaps it was a little arrogant to think this way. But Brando believed that it was not necessary to do it, but to have done it, at least to make up for regrets. So it was not only Freya's choice, but also his choice. That was why he felt that time was tight. He needed to at least have a certain amount of power and authority during this short period of peace between the end of the War of the Black Rose and the beginning of the Civil War in December. Any way to rise up in this rotten system was unreliable, and he did not have the time. In this chaotic world, the only way to quickly regain the power of a chess player was to obtain territory and an army. He did have a plan. In the West, in the Dusty Kingdom. P.S. This is the second chapter, there is another chapter before it. Because it was inconvenient to disconnect from the internet, it was released at the same time. Internet cafes are really not good places, they always smell of smoke. To be continued. If you want to know the future, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 103. When Breton passed by the courtyard, he saw palm-sized leaves of the Four Seasons tree in grimoires. According to Erwin's legends, every leaf of the Four Seasons tree had the spirit of a hero who died in battle. That was why the military camp often planted such trees to symbolize the bravery of the soldiers. When he looked at the leaves, he could not help but think of the faces of his comrades who died in the war. For a moment, he even turned a deaf ear to the words of his father, Bragg's city councillor Sir Harbeck. Once the rewards are announced, I will try to move you around and see if I can transfer you back to Brugloss. Do you want to join the public security cavalry? I still have some say in the city hall. If you want to continue to stay in the garrison, it is not impossible. The patrol team on the coniferous forest avenue is not full. However, they belong to Anzac's organization, so it might be a little tough. Actually, my idea is to wait until you are officially appointed as a knight, then you can come to the Parliament of Nobles to seek a stable position. Breton replied. Speaking of which, what do you think? Sir Harbeck looked at his young and impetuous son and could not help but sigh. This son of his had the same personality as when he was young. He was confident, but too proud. Sometimes, this was not a bad thing, but it was not necessarily a good thing either. In the maxim passed down from mouth to mouth among the nobles, if one was too proud, one would easily suffer setbacks. Sir Harbeck was 62 years old this year. In Wonde, this was considered the prime of his life, but he was also slightly old. Strands of silver hair stretched out from his meticulous hairstyle and dyed his temples white. When he was young, he was also a well-known radical in the south of Grimoires. However, as he grew older, he became more conservative and tactful. Sir Harbeck was wearing a blue coat that reached the ground. Inside, he was wearing a white button vest and black long breeches. He held a cane in one hand and looked at his only son with a kind gaze. Breton looked at his father. He replied, "I think I might go to the Boston Royal Cavalry Academy." "What?" Sir Harbeck was shocked. "I got the news from Walter. There are 4 spots in total. The guards might nominate me, and the White Mane Army might also have thoughts about it, but father, please don't go to the nobles to discuss this matter." Breton replied. Walter was the deputy commander of the Silver-Winged Cavalry. He was only 23 years old this year, and was only able to obtain his position because of his father's protection. They were close friends. The news is really tightly sealed. There's no news from the Parliament of Nobles at all. However, such an award shouldn't be given by the royal family. Did something happen? Sir Harbeck asked with a frown. "It's hard to say, but I've made up my mind." Breton replied. "That's good too, I'll learn more." However, you have to remember that the Wakefield family's political views have always been biased towards the local area. When you arrive at the Royal Academy, don't clash with the royal faction. Of course, you also don't have to be overly worried about them. Sir Harbeck thought for a moment and changed his decision at the last minute. Breton looked towards the courtyard and replied, "Who would care about a small fish?" "I don't like what you're saying. Everyone in the Wakefield family is a hero. Your grandfather was the chairman of the Parliament of Nobles and Brags. When I was young, I was also famous in the southern part of Grenoires. You are my son, so of course you won't be inferior to them." Sir Harbeck reprimanded. Breton remained expressionless. However, the father and son suddenly stopped talking as they saw a young man walking towards them. He wore a dark blue military uniform with a 32-year-old cavalry sword on his belt. His long silver hair reached his shoulders, and he pursed his lips. There was a feminine beauty to his face. "Sergeant Terst. Viscount Terst." Sir Harbeck hurriedly pulled his son to the side and greeted him. The man who was called Terst was startled. He raised his head and looked at the old man and the young man with his amethyst-like eyes. He nodded and was about to pass. However, when his gaze landed on Breton, he suddenly stopped and smiled. He then walked past them and continued on his way. "Strange," Sir Harbeck muttered to himself as he watched the young man walk away. "What's the matter?" Breton asked. "Isn't that kid the Duke's illegitimate son? He has always been arrogant. Why does he seem a little strange today?" Sir Harbeck replied. Breton turned around and looked at the young man's back. He did not reply, but when he turned around again, he seemed to be deep in thought. When Terst pushed open the door to the Silver-Winged Cavalry's command post, the commander of the Silver-Winged Cavalry, Viscount Majeska, was staring blankly outside the window. This middle-aged man with a head full of white hair heard the door open and turned around. When he saw Terst, he relaxed. He took out his pipe and pointed to a seat for the man. He smiled and said, "You didn't come very quickly, Sergeant." "Because I had to chase away those troublemakers." The silver-haired man smiled and sat down. Just like the rumors said, Terst was the illegitimate son of the Duke of Grenoires. However, his mother was from the Sioux clan, a legendary lost silver folk. Because of this, he believed that the blood of the silver folk flowed in his veins. However, unlike the young man's cold and arrogant personality, Terst had a shrewd side. Otherwise, he would not have become one of the core members of All for One. However, this layer of relationship was not something that only the two of them knew. "So you saw those people?" Majeska asked. Terst nodded. The young man leaned back slightly and replied in a calm manner, "A young man and that red-bearded Badam. They are small fries in the lower ranks of the iron-ranked. There is nothing noteworthy about them. However, it is a pleasant surprise that there is a Butchie militia among them. Commander, I don't think I need to say more. You must have received the news earlier than me, right? Majeska put down his pipe. That girl is called Freya. She is one of the 4 candidates. What do you think? Interesting. Terst laughed. Are you going to tell me that she is the illegitimate daughter of one of the higher-ups? That's enough. What does that have to do with us? Majeska replied, but if that is the case, then we will be able to rule out any suspicions. The one who killed Thor was a person, so he should be at least an iron-ranked or even a silver-ranked warrior. I wonder what that copper dragon Reto is like. The commander of the silver-winged cavalry sat down and replied casually, I heard that the Silver Pigeons faction was furious about this. They accused us of not appointing a silver-ranked or gold-ranked swordsman for that fool. The young man sneered, it's just a substitute. It won't be too late to talk about it after we replace the famous Wolf Knight. The organization doesn't need trash. In fact, I've always suspected that Oberway might have noticed something was amiss that night. Majeska nodded. Also, my men received news when they were investigating the refugees that night. There was a commotion in Fortress Reden that night, and the location should be around the Parliament of Nobles. But as for what happened that night, only the nobles would know. Terst shrugged, it's a pity that those idiots lost their lives without leaving a single one behind. Majeska asked, what do you think Luke Besson would know? Even if that tiger knew, he wouldn't say anything. He's not on our side. Terst said with a double meaning. Indeed, no matter if it's the White Mane Army or us, that bastard is an anomaly. Majeska replied. So what do you plan to do? Aren't you in charge of this internally? Why are you asking me what to do? Sergeant Major, isn't this a little against the rules? The commander was startled and laughed. Terst shook his head, no, you're in charge of it now. I'm here to hand over the relevant matters and to ask for leave as a Sergeant Major of the White Mane Army. What's wrong? There's news of the Lionheart. Majeska was startled, that's fast. How did they get the news? Terst smiled and did not reply. After leaving Freya at the Silver-Winged Cavalry camp, Brando went to Braggs's Lagenbund market to meet Tamar, who had been waiting for a long time. This future master alchemist probably didn't expect that he was one of the most influential figures in Madara's history. But at this time, he was wearing a strange checkered robe and standing under the scorching sun of June and July. When he saw Brando, he still showed a respectful expression. My lord, the things you asked for are ready. Tamar carried a heavy backpack and pulled his son along as he respectfully stood beside Brando. His respect was not because Brando was a noble, but because he was his savior. But his son was not as reserved as him. Instead, he looked at Brando with a face full of admiration. There were not many children who didn't worship this knight. You managed to buy it. Brando was surprised. He didn't expect that Braggs would be able to buy authentic elven alchemy utensils in the market. He asked Tamar to take a look, but it was just a casual suggestion. After all, the refined alchemy utensils produced by the merchants in the free port of Ampere Seal could also be used. Tamar looked at the young knight and replied, I rented it from the local alchemy union. They asked for 2,000 tor. The future alchemist said so, but he couldn't help but complain in his heart. Normal alchemy did not require such good conditions. When he was in the noble parliament, he only used a second-hand set of alchemy utensils. This knight was good at everything, but he spent too much money. Brando slapped his forehead. He actually forgot about this. But it was even better if he could buy it. After all, he shouldn't be too short on money after this period of time. However, unlike Tamar, he had his own plans. He wanted to refine a set of poison daggers with 15 ounces of dried venom and a set of cursed crossbows with 32 ounces of cursed bolts. Although he had some basic strength now, it was not his style to not have any hidden trump cards. The daggers could be sold to the nobles. The tree's spirit venom was colorless and formless. Those who died from it would have the same symptoms as those who died from a sudden illness. For those who were below the iron rank, this was undoubtedly the best way to help them. The cursed bolts were a magic weapon that low-level characters needed to kill and commit arson. Of course, they were Brando's first choice. These bolts had a certain chance of inflicting fatigue, weakening, and increased damage on the enemy. Although it was easy to resist at high levels, it was very effective against enemies below the silver rank. The only downside of this item was that the materials used were too expensive. The soul of a mid-level necromancer was difficult to obtain under level 40. This time, Brando was only able to obtain it thanks to the useless nobles in Fortress Reden. Of course, making 35 ounces of equipment required a level 8 alchemy skill. For Brando, this was not a small problem. But fortunately, the elven alchemy utensils that he obtained increased his alchemy level by 1. If he had the help of a professional alchemist, it could even increase his alchemy level by 1. He also rented an enchanted alchemy workshop. He had just reached level 8, so it should be enough. P.S. My stomach is so bloated that I can't sleep. I haven't eaten for 2 days. That's all for today. I'll make up the rest tomorrow. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 104. Brendel lined up the 11 daggers that looked like handicrafts, and then used his silver hammer to break the tree crystal from the rotten beast's body and melt it into the alchemy liquid. Then he turned back and said, "Let's go. Tamar, why don't you give it a try?" "Me?" The middle-aged man standing behind Brando was slightly stunned, but his face showed an eager expression. Although this future master alchemist was usually taciturn, he couldn't help but talk loudly when it came to alchemy. But no matter how much he said, it was not as good as trying it out himself. Although Tamar had the title of an alchemist in the Parliament of Nobles, he usually only helped to purify some insignificant materials. After all, most of the nobles with a little bit of status had their own alchemists, and would not easily reveal their secrets. Thus, it was Tamar's first time refining a magic item with his own hands. Thus, when he looked at the 11 daggers, he could not help but gulp for a moment. Brando smiled and nodded. Tamar's alchemy skills had improved very quickly. When they first met, Brendel guessed that he should be a level 3 alchemist based on his actual ability and experience. Now, he estimated that Tamar was about to reach level 5. At this speed, it would not be long before this future master alchemist surpassed him and entered the ranks of professional alchemists. This made Brando sigh at the power of talent. Of course, this was also due to the large amount of practice in purifying the evening primrose, fluorescent moss, and black mage. Brando's own alchemy skills were locked at level 5 because of his identity as a commoner, so he simply gave all the practice opportunities to this future master alchemist, which led to Tamar's rapid improvement in the past month. But this master alchemist seemed to be unaware of his own talent, so when Brando expressed his intention to recruit him, Tamar gladly agreed out of gratitude for saving his life and recognizing his talent. He even took the initiative to reduce the commission by a large amount. Brando had originally proposed 30,000 years of annuity, but this future master alchemist only wanted a symbolic sixth of it. Hiring a master alchemist with 5,000 years worth of annuity, even a retainer would cost more than that. However, Brando wasn't worried. After all, aristocratic alchemists were very private. Generally, they wouldn't break the contract. Besides, he believed that he could afford to keep Tamar in the future. Because no one knew better than him how far this alchemy master could go. "Okay, I'll try. The middle-aged man only thought for a moment and immediately agreed. Brando smiled. What he admired was the other party's confidence in his field of expertise. When the alchemy lab quieted down, the young man casually picked up a history book from the bookshelf and started reading it. His knowledge of nobility and heraldry had reached level 6, and his scholar level had reached level 11. Other than leveling up his military swordsmanship to level 6+1, first aid to level 4, and White Raven swordsmanship to level 2, he also learned weapon mastery, mercenary, crossbow mastery, mercenary, camouflage and tree resilience. Weapon mastery was a skill exclusive to both mercenaries and warriors. It was also the core skill of a mercenary. It was only level 1, and the core introduction was only one sentence. A character with this skill would have learned all military and simple weapons, even if they had never done any training before. To put it bluntly, weapon mastery saved a lot of skill experience, and it was also suitable for a mercenary's role in the battlefield. If a character wanted to be proficient in all weapons, how much skill experience would be wasted if they didn't learn weapon mastery? In the end, it was about 12 to 13,000. This was a huge investment even in the later stages of the game. Therefore, many of the other professions in the game were mercenaries and warriors. Most of the time, they were doing it for this skill. But in other words, other than warriors and mercenaries, there were very few professions that would use that many weapons. Crossbow mastery was an in-depth training for crossbows. Different professions often had different weapon mastery, but mercenaries had almost all weapon mastery skills except for wands, scepters, and wands. In this aspect, he was even one step ahead of warriors. After all, mercenaries were synonymous with being versatile. He could even practice magic, but the result of being proficient in everything was that he was proficient in nothing. This was also the biggest flaw of the mercenary profession. Concealment came from Nightingale and other professions that were often active in the dark, and tree resilience came from Druid. This was an active self-protection skill, and also one of the most practical non-core skills of Druid, *. It could convert mana for a period of time, turning the whole body's skin into a tree trunk. Every level increased natural defense by 50%. This skill was very practical when paired with a large number of natural defense amulets. It was also one of the most commonly used battle structures in the later stages of the game by Brando. Of course, the main reason was that these two skills were clearly marked in Braggs's Royal Geographical Society, *. The young man naturally wouldn't let them go. There weren't many opportunities to learn cross-profession skills, not to mention this kind of skill that didn't require him to do any missions. Of course, after learning these skills one by one, the hundreds of skill experience points that he had painstakingly squeezed out from the scholar profession were all used up. In fact, Brando also knew that the skill experience points in the game were originally a means of compensation. The game required players to level up their skills through practice and usage. But Brando didn't have the time to do so. Thinking back to the battle in the Valley of Sharp Stones, his swordsmanship was only about 6+2. But Brando had only flipped a few pages of the book in his hand when Tamar's alchemy was completed. The future master alchemist excitedly took out a dagger and said as if he was a child showing off his toy. "My lord, it's done. So fast." Brando secretly looked at the time. The hourglass had only dropped a third. No waste. No. Tamar shook his head confidently. Brando couldn't help but be amazed. Tamar's first attempt at making a magic item didn't have any waste. This was not something that ordinary people could do. He remembered that his failure rate in the game was as high as 46% before he made 100 alchemy attempts, and that was considered to be one of the better ones among the newbies. He sighed and took a look at the dagger. At the same time, he opened the attribute panel. These little things were bought from the blacksmith's workshop. They dealt 1 to 2 damage, but this time, there was a 1 to 1 poison, suffix behind it. The name of the dagger was also changed to Tree Essence Poison Dagger. The tag was black iron. Brando put the dagger back on the iron plate. He thought for a while. This little thing could probably be sold for 2,000 tor per dagger. After all, most of his customers were low-level nobles or rogues. The nobles had their own personal alchemists, and they looked down on these little things. 20,000 tor was still a little far from the amount he promised the little Roman. But the young man did not panic. He took out the high-quality tree crystal from the golden demonic tree and a dwarven dagger that Badam bought. The next one is a little more troublesome. Let's do it together, Tamar, he said. Together. Tamar was a little surprised. Most alchemists completed their missions alone, but at most, they would work together with wizards. He had never heard of two alchemists working together without interfering with each other's magic waves. But Brando did not have this concern. He used a piece of chalk to draw a circle on the ground and then added numbers and runes around the circle. Tamar's eyes were filled with surprise. He saw that the numbers were the coordinates of the constellations used by the wizards. Then Brando raised his head and pointed at the second section of the circle. Come here. Tamar looked at the completed circle on the ground and was shocked beyond belief. He was stunned for a while and blurted out, "My lord, is this the ritual of the ring?" Ritual of the ring. I heard that only the wizards of Buga knew this secret technique. The great wizards who stood on the main planet could use the power of many people to complete spells or alchemy. My lord, this is. More or less, this is a simplified version of 16 people. When I have the chance, I'll draw a complete circle of 32 and 64 people for you to see. Brando nodded. What was inconceivable in Tamar's eyes was a skill that every player in his world must master. The middle-aged man's eyes immediately lit up with fanaticism. The future master alchemist nodded his head and stood in the middle of the magic circle with an eager look, as if he was even more eager than Brendel to witness the power of the magic circle. Brando smiled and picked up the short sword. The short sword of the dwarves was made into a beautiful long-pointed trapezoid according to the aesthetic style of the people of the mountains. The surface of the sword was infused with the magic of the rocks. The young man put his finger on it and sensed that it was a spell similar to the rocky edge. But fortunately, the magic of the earth and the magic of nature did not conflict, so it did not affect his next work. So he picked up a fine gold chisel and made a hole in the short sword. Ouch! Badam finally could not help but yell at the door. What the hell are you yelling for, Badam? Brendel's hand almost trembled from the shock. If it was not for the fact that he was skilled in martial arts, the sword that added 1,500 tor would have been scrapped. At this time, Brando did not have the money to buy another one. The red-bearded mercenary knew that he almost got into trouble, so he did not answer. However, his heart was bleeding. Ordinary craftsmen would be heartbroken if they saw this knight destroying the work of the dwarven ironsmith, right? Unfortunately, Brando did not have this awareness. He picked up the chisel and hammered it again. This time, Badam's heart was pounding. But Brando ignored him. He picked up the sword, inserted the crystal of the golden demonic tree into the hole, and then nodded to Tamar. The two began to draw runes on the two sides of the short sword. About half an hour later, a brand new magic weapon appeared in front of the three of them. Brando picked up the pointed sword. The golden earth runes and the green nature runes reflected each other. But more importantly, its attribute was changed to 3-4 attack, 3-3 poison. This meant that the lethality of this sword was comparable to the Thorn of Light. Of course, other than the fact that it was not as sharp, there was also the fact that it did not have any additional magic attribute. But just this sword alone was enough to be labeled as a brass-grade weapon. It would not be a problem to sell it for 100,000 in the underground black market. Because no matter if it was a noble, an adventurer, or a mercenary, they would not mind having a good sword. Even some knight who was not bound by the rules of the world would not be an exception. Brendel looked at the sword and wiped the sweat off his forehead. This was the first time in this world that he had crafted a magic equipment that was above 15 OZ. 14 layers of runes almost made him collapse, but the rewards were still plentiful. Not to mention that the sword was perfect beyond his imagination, he even felt that his alchemy skills were showing signs of a breakthrough. Brando was almost certain that once he obtained the identity of a noble knight, his alchemy skills would immediately break through the current level and reach a 5+1. He looked up at Tamar and saw that this future master alchemist still had an unsatisfied look on his face. Tamar's eyes were shining as he said, "My lord, I think I have figured out some things. If there are no accidents, it is only a matter of time before I master a higher level of runes and magic circles, a professional alchemist." Brando was overjoyed. It seemed that he would have to add a professional alchemist to his team. For non-players, level 5 was a bottleneck. Once they broke through level 5, they would be able to reach level 10 in alchemy. Once they reached level 10, they would be able to create dragon-slaying arrows, 40 ounces. This was good news. P.S. I've been fooled by some idiots in LK again. Some idiots always use the most malicious words to speculate about others. What I want to say is, since you hate me so much, you shouldn't read my book. I don't want to disgust your discerning eyes. Seeing that she was reading my book while scolding me, I couldn't help but feel sad. Could it be that she was the legendary M, a natural bottom? Her Buddhist name was not masochistic, not comfortable skiver. The word count is about to exceed the limit, so I'll continue to talk to everyone in the next chapter. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.